Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's strangest chapters, a time when doctors believed something absolutely extraordinary. They thought that inside every woman's body lived a creature, not a baby, not a tumour, but an actual animal that could get bored, become angry and wander freely through the body like a restless ghost searching for something it had lost. This wasn't folklore, this wasn't superstition, this was science. Or at least what passed for science in an era when the mere thought of a woman wanting independence sent educated men into a panic so deep they'd invent diseases to explain it away. Now, I know that might sound wild, but if you think that's the strangest thing Victorian society believed about women, well, you're in for quite a night. Because over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore the most absurd, bizarre, and frankly hilarious fears that gripped an entire civilization. Fears about women riding bicycles, fears about women reading novels, fears about women going to university, fears that seem so ridiculous now you'll wonder how anyone ever took them seriously. But here's the thing, they did take them seriously, deadly seriously, and thousands of women suffered because of it. So before we dive into this fascinating and bizarre world together, I'd love it if you could do something for me. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, if this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like, but only if you genuinely find value in what I'm sharing with you tonight. I'd also love to know where you are right now as you listen to this. Are you in bed, lights dimmed, ready to drift off? Are you on a long drive watching the road stretch ahead? Or maybe you're doing dishes, folding laundry, just wanting some company. Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I truly appreciate you being here. Alright, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let the tension leave your shoulders, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, or light a candle if that helps you relax. We're about to step back in time, into gaslit rooms and examining chambers, into a world where the female body was considered such a mystery, such a threat, that men in positions of power had to create elaborate fantasies just to feel in control. Let's begin. Picture this. Ancient Greece around 400 years before the Common Era. Hippocrates, the father of medicine himself, the man whose oath doctors still swear by today, is studying women's health. And he comes to a remarkable conclusion. The uterus, he decides, is not actually an organ, it's an animal, a separate creature living inside the female body, and like any animal, it has desires, it has needs, and most importantly, it can move. Now I want you to really think about that for a moment. Imagine believing that inside your body, or inside the body of every woman you know, there's a creature with its own agenda. Hippocrates wasn't alone in this belief. The philosopher Plato agreed. He wrote that the womb was an animal within an animal, desirous of procreating children. And when this internal animal didn't get what it wanted, when a woman remained childless for too long, the womb would become, in Plato's words, discontented and angry. And what does an angry animal do? It wanders, it moves, it searches. The ancient Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia described it in vivid detail. The uterus, he said, closely resembles an animal in that it moves by itself here and there on the flanks, upward toward the liver, toward the spleen, even toward the heart. In short, he concluded, the womb is like an animal within an animal. Now here's where it gets even stranger. This wandering womb had preferences. It had likes and dislikes. Ancient doctors genuinely believed that the uterus could smell. It was attracted to sweet, pleasant fragrances and absolutely repulsed by foul odours. This wasn't poetry, this wasn't metaphor. They really truly believed this. So if a woman fainted, if she had trouble breathing, if she felt a sensation like something was stuck in her throat, Doctors had an explanation. The womb had travelled upward, maybe lodging itself near the lungs or heart, causing all sorts of problems. They called this condition hysterical suffocation. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, and the cure? Well, if you wanted to lure the womb back to its proper place, you had to think like you were dealing with a stubborn pet. Doctors would place sweet-smelling substances near a woman's genital region. Honey, fragrant oils, chamomile, anything pleasant. The theory was that the womb, attracted by these lovely scents, would migrate back downward toward where it belonged. But that wasn't enough. You also had to repel it from the upper body. So doctors would place foul-smelling substances near the woman's nose, burnt wool, burnt leather, in some cases actual animal excrement. The idea was to make the upper body so unpleasant that the womb would flee back to its natural position, escaping the stench by moving down and away. Can you imagine? Lying there as a doctor holds burning leather under your nose while placing honey between your legs, all in the sincere belief that this would cure your fainting spells. And this wasn't some fringe treatment. This was mainstream medicine. This was recommended by the most respected physicians of the ancient world. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. Not everyone agreed with this theory. The physician Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, actually pushed back against it. He wrote, "The uterus does not issue forth like a wild animal from its lair, delighted by fragrant odours and fleeing bad odours. Rather, it is drawn together because of stricture caused by inflammation." Even Galen of Pergamon, arguably the most influential medical writer of the ancient world, insisted that the uterus was held in place by ligaments and muscles. It couldn't actually wander around. Another physician named Herophilus had even discovered these ligaments through dissection. He argued that extensive movement was impossible. The anatomy simply didn't allow for it. But despite these voices of reason, despite anatomical evidence to the contrary, the idea of the wandering womb persisted. It continued through the Roman Empire, it survived into medieval times, and astonishingly, it was still influencing medical thought well into the Victorian era, nearly 2,000 years later. Now, you might be wondering how an idea so obviously wrong could survive for so long. How could generations of doctors ignore the anatomical evidence? How could they keep prescribing treatments that involved essentially trying to coax an organ back into place with perfume? The answer is both simple and profound. The wandering womb theory wasn't really about medicine. It was about control. It was about explaining away women's emotions, women's complaints, women's pain. If a woman was unhappy in her marriage, the womb was wandering. If she was anxious or irritable, the womb was wandering. If she had any symptom that doctors couldn't explain, well, obviously it was the womb. By the time we reached the Victorian era, the theory had evolved. Doctors no longer believed the womb could physically travel to the heart or liver, but they held on to the core idea. They believed that the womb, and specifically a woman's lack of sexual activity or pregnancy, caused widespread health problems. They gave this condition a name that would become infamous: hysteria. In 1859, a physician made an astonishing claim. He stated that 1/4 of all women suffered from hysteria. Think about that. 25% of the entire female population, according to this doctor, had this condition. And what were the symptoms? Well, that's where things get truly absurd. Dr. George Beard, a prominent American physician, created what he called a comprehensive catalogue of hysteria symptoms. It filled 75 pages. 75 pages of possible symptoms. And at the end of this enormous list, he added a note. This list, he wrote, is incomplete. The symptoms included everything you can imagine: faintness, nervousness, insomnia, muscle spasms, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, irritability, fluid retention, heaviness in the abdomen. The list went on, but perhaps the most telling symptom was this one: a tendency to cause trouble. Let that sink in for a moment. Being a troublemaker was literally listed as a medical symptom of a uterine disease. If a woman questioned her husband, if she wanted to make her own decisions, if she expressed dissatisfaction with her life, she might be diagnosed as hysterical. The problem, doctors said, was in her womb. This wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a tool, a way to dismiss women's legitimate complaints and concerns. A woman unhappy in her marriage, hysteria. A woman who wanted an education, hysteria. A woman who dared to ask for a divorce, hysteria. And once you were labelled hysterical, your opinions, your feelings, your entire experience could be dismissed. After all, you weren't thinking clearly. You were sick. Your womb was causing problems. And the treatments? They range from the mundane to the invasive to the downright disturbing. Rest cures that confined women to bed for weeks. Bland diets. Isolation from family and friends. Avoiding any activity that might stimulate the brain, including reading. Some women were told that frequent intercourse was the cure. Others underwent pelvic massage by their doctors until they reached what physicians called hysterical paroxysm. We'd call it orgasm today, but Victorian doctors couldn't quite admit what they were doing. The strangest part. Doctors genuinely believed these treatments worked. They saw hysterical paroxysm as a medical release, a way to relieve the symptoms caused by the wandering, dissatisfied womb. They developed machines to make the treatment more efficient. By 1870, clockwork-driven vibrators were available for physicians. By 1873, the first electromechanical vibrator was being used in asylums in France, and women kept coming back for treatment, which doctors took as proof that hysteria was widespread and chronic. It never occurred to them that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't medical at all. That perhaps women weren't suffering from wandering wombs, but from lives of confinement, boredom, lack of agency, and complete dependence on men who viewed them as fundamentally irrational beings. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The diagnosis of hysteria wasn't just used to explain away women's complaints. It was used to lock them up. Victorian asylums were filled with women diagnosed as hysterical, and the reasons for admission? They'd shock you. Laziness was grounds for commitment, rigorous intellectual study, being in bad company, religious obsession. Even asking for a divorce could get a woman declared insane and institutionalized. The asylum, as historians have noted, offered families a convenient and socially acceptable excuse for dealing with inappropriate or potentially scandalous behavior. Surveys from the time reveal that there were disproportionately more women than men in asylums, and while some of these women genuinely suffered from mental illness by any standard, many were misdiagnosed. Epilepsy was frequently mistaken for hysteria. So were anxiety disorders. So were the symptoms of real physical illnesses that doctors simply couldn't identify. The physicians of the Victorian era inherited 2,000 years of medical theory that blamed the womb for women's problems. And they couldn't let it go. Even as scientific understanding advanced, even as the anatomy became better understood, the core belief persisted. Women were fundamentally ruled by their reproductive organs, their emotions, their behaviors, their entire existence was dictated by the womb. This belief system did something insidious. It created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Women were denied education, told it would damage their reproductive capacity. They were confined to the home, told the outside world was too stressful for their delicate constitutions. They had no legal rights, no property rights, no way to escape bad marriages. And then, when they became depressed, anxious, or angry about these restrictions, doctors pointed to their symptoms and said, "See, this proves women are naturally unstable. It's the womb." What's particularly striking is how convenient this all was for men in power. If women are biologically prone to irrationality, then obviously they can't be trusted with important decisions. They can't vote. They can't own property. They can't work in professions. They can't be independent. They need men to take care of them, to make decisions for them, to protect them from their own wandering wombs. It's almost funny when you step back and look at it. Almost. Except for the fact that real women suffered real consequences. Women who wanted more from life than marriage and motherhood were drugged. Women who expressed dissatisfaction were labelled as sick. Women who sought education or independence were seen as defying nature itself. The wandering womb theory in all its various forms persisted because it served a purpose. It wasn't about healing women. It was about explaining them away, about providing a medical justification for keeping them in their place, about transforming social control into a diagnosis, oppression into treatment. And here's the thing that should really keep you up at night. The theory only started to fade in the early 20th century. Not because doctors suddenly recognized the injustice of it all, but because the diagnosis had become so overused, so vague, so applied to absolutely everything, that it lost meaning. By the 1930s, the term hysteria was disappearing from medical literature. By 1980, it was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders entirely, but the damage had been done. For thousands of years, women's pain, women's emotions, women's legitimate grievances had been dismissed as symptoms of a wandering womb. For thousands of years, the medical establishment had looked at women not as complex human beings, but as creatures controlled by their reproductive organs. For thousands of years, science, so-called, had provided and for oppression. The wandering womb is gone from modern medicine. We no longer believe in hysterical suffocation or the therapeutic power of burnt leather and honey. But the impulse behind it, the desire to medicalize women's discontent, to find biological explanations for why women might want something different from what society offers them, that impulse didn't die with hysteria. It just evolved. It found new forms, new expressions, new vocabularies. And that's what makes this history so important to understand, because the Victorian doctors who diagnosed hysteria weren't monsters. They were products of their time, absolutely convinced they were helping. They believed in the wandering womb the same way they believed in bloodletting and leeches, and all the other medical practices we now know were useless or harmful. They thought they were being scientific. They thought they were being rational. They never stopped to question whether the problem was their theories, not women's bodies. So as you drift off tonight, as you process this strange and unsettling history, remember this. The wandering womb wasn't a medical mistake. It was a social tool disguised as science. And recognizing that, understanding that, helps us see similar patterns in our own time. Helps us question medical and scientific claims that seem a little too convenient, a little too perfectly aligned with existing power structures. The womb never wandered. It was always exactly where anatomy said it should be. But the idea of it wandering, the belief in it that wandered through centuries of medical thought, adapting and evolving, always serving the same basic purpose. Keeping women in their place by convincing everyone, including women themselves, that their bodies made them fundamentally unsuited for anything else. Now you might be thinking that the wandering womb is the strangest Victorian fear about female independence. But as we'll discover next, Victorian society had so many more bizarre anxieties about what would happen if women stepped outside their prescribed roles, and some of them, somehow, are even more absurd than a wandering uterus. Because coming up next, we're going to talk about a disease that terrified Victorian doctors, a condition so serious that medical journals across Europe and America published grave warnings about it. An epidemic, they said, that threatened to rob women of their beauty, their femininity, and their very faces. What was this dreaded illness? Riding a bicycle, I'm not joking. They called it bicycle face, and they were completely serious about it. But that's a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let the strangeness of the wandering womb settle in your mind. Let yourself marvel at how far we've come and perhaps wonder how far we still have to go. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next chapter of this bizarre Victorian tale. So here we are. The year is 1895. The place, any major city in America or Europe, and something extraordinary is happening. Women are riding bicycles. Not just a few rebellious souls, not just working-class women who had no choice but to move about the city. No, middle-class women, respectable women, women of society are climbing onto bicycles and riding them through the streets, alone, without chaperones, without permission, without fear. And Victorian society is having an absolute meltdown about it. You might think I'm exaggerating, but I promise you I'm not. Because when doctors couldn't stop women from riding, when warnings about impropriety didn't work, when social pressure failed to keep women in their place, the medical establishment did what it always did. It invented a disease. They called it bicycle face, and they were dead serious about it. Now, before we dive into the absolute absurdity of this so-called medical condition, I want you to think about something for a moment. Have you ever seen someone riding a bike and thought, oh my goodness, that person looks absolutely terrible? Has cycling ever permanently disfigured anyone you know? Of course not, that would be ridiculous. But in 1895, respected physicians were publishing papers in medical journals claiming exactly that. They were warning women that riding a bicycle would permanently ruin their faces. The Literary Digest, a well-respected publication at the time, described the symptoms with grave concern. They wrote, and I'm quoting directly here, that bicycle face was characterized by a face usually flushed, but sometimes pale, often with lips more or less drawn, and the beginning of dark shadows under the eyes, and always with an expression of weariness. Does that sound familiar to you? Because it should. That's literally just what your face looks like when you're concentrating on something. That's what everyone's face looks like when they're learning a new physical activity. That's what your face looks like in traffic on a Monday morning. But Victorian doctors looked at women on bicycles, saw that they were focused and determined, and decided this must be a disease. Dr. A. Shadwell, writing in the National Review in 1897, claimed to have coined the term. He described it as though he'd discovered some dreadful new plague. The condition, he warned, came from overexertion, the upright position on the wheel, and the unconscious effort to maintain one's balance. All of this, he said, produced a weary and exhausted bicycle face. Now, let's pause here, because this is where it gets interesting. Notice what they're really describing. They're describing physical effort. They're describing concentration. They're describing a woman actively engaged in controlling her own movement through space. And they're calling it a disease. The symptoms, according to various medical authorities of the day, included a hard, clenched jaw and bulging eyes. Some doctors reported that the face could become permanently fixed in this expression. Others warned of dark circles that would never fade. Still others claimed that women's features would become masculine, harsh, unattractive. One physician actually wrote that bicycle face would frighten a mule from the path of duty. I'm not making that up. That's an actual quote from the medical literature of the time. And here's the thing that really tells you what was going on. The newspapers of 1895 published long lists of don'ts for female cyclists. The New York World ran one that became infamous, and when you read through it, you can see exactly what they were really worried about. Don't wear a man's cap, don't wear tight garters, don't attempt a century. That's a 100-mile ride, by the way. Don't coast, it is dangerous. Don't boast of your long rides. Don't criticize people's legs. Don't wear loud-hued leggings. And right there in the middle of all these rules about appearance and behavior, sandwiched between concerns about fashion and etiquette, you find it. Don't cultivate a bicycle face. Notice something. Most of these don'ts aren't about safety, they're about maintaining femininity, they're about not being too bold, too fast, too free, too masculine. The bicycle face wasn't a medical concern, it was a social control mechanism dressed up in scientific language. But bicycle face was just the beginning of the medical horrors that doctors warned would befall female cyclists. They published papers claiming that cycling would cause tuberculosis, depression, infertility, something they called kyphosis bicycle starum, which was supposedly a hunched back caused by riding. They warned of tachycardia, of anemia, of eye strain. There were rumours on the streets of London that actresses had been rendered mute from breathing too heavily while cycling. Dancers supposedly found themselves crippled by overdeveloped leg muscles. The catalogue of supposed cycling diseases included mental and nervous conditions like hysteria. Yes, hysteria again. Also neurasthenia, disorientation, sudden breakdowns caused by stress, and tension due to the unconscious effect of constantly balancing. Apparently, the mere act of balancing on two wheels was enough to destroy a woman's nervous system. And here's what's truly fascinating. Some doctors claimed the opposite. They said cycling was wonderful for women's health. They prescribed it as a cure for nervous disorders, dyspepsia, and general languor. One Harley Street physician, Dr. W. H. Fenton, estimated that 90% of diseases afflicting Victorian women were functional ailments begotten of ennui and lack of opportunity to work off their superfluous muscular, nervous, and organic energy. So which was it? Was cycling destroying women's health or saving it? The answer, of course, depended on whether the doctor in question wanted women to be independent or not. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone actually believe this bicycle face nonsense? Did women stay off their bikes because of it? Well, some did. The campaign of fear was effective enough that many women hesitated. But here's the beautiful part of this story. Many more women said, essentially, to heck with that, and rode anyway. In 1895, a woman named Annie Londonderry Kopchowski did something extraordinary. She rode a bicycle around the world. Around the entire world. It took her 15 months. She travelled from Boston to New York, sailed to France, cycled to Marseille, went on to Alexandria, Colombo, Singapore, Saigon, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and eventually San Francisco before returning to Boston. And at the end of this epic journey, the New York World declared it the most extraordinary journey ever undertaken by a woman. Did she develop bicycle face? No. Did her uterus fall out from the vibrations of the saddle? No. Did she become mute or crippled or develop a hunched back? Obviously not. She did, however, become a journalist, writing under the byline The New Woman, proclaiming, "I am a journalist and a new woman, if that term means that I believe I can do anything that any man can do." And she wasn't alone. Despite the warnings, despite the mockery, despite actual physical attacks, women kept cycling. Emma Eads, one of the first women to ride a bike in London, was attacked with bricks and stones as she pedalled through the streets. Bricks and stones for riding a bicycle. But she kept riding, because here's what the bicycle actually represented. Freedom. For the first time in history, women had access to independent transportation that they could control themselves. They didn't need a horse, which required expensive upkeep and someone to saddle it. They didn't need a carriage, which required a driver. They didn't need to wait for a man to escort them somewhere. They could get on a bike and go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist, understood this perfectly. In 1896, she made a statement that has echoed through history. She said, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. It gives her a feeling of freedom, self-reliance and independence. And that right there is why doctors invented bicycle face. That's why medical journals published grave warnings about the dangers of women cycling. Not because there was any actual medical evidence, not because they genuinely believed women's faces would be permanently disfigured. but because bicycles represented freedom, and freedom was dangerous. The bicycle did more than just provide transportation, it forced a fashion revolution. You simply could not ride a bicycle in a corset and a bustle and layers upon layers of heavy skirts. Women needed practical clothing, they needed to be able to move their legs freely. And so bloomers came back into fashion, split skirts, eventually even trousers. The cycling craze and the dress reform movement fed into each other. Women who wore bloomers to ride bicycles started wearing them for other activities too. Women who experienced the freedom of moving without restriction began to question why they'd ever tolerated those torturous garments in the first place. The bicycle, this simple machine with two wheels, was quietly dismantling centuries of female restriction. And Victorian men knew it. They saw what was happening. They saw women travelling unchaperoned. They saw women developing strong, capable bodies. They saw women spending time away from home, making their own decisions about where to go and when. They saw women gathering in cycling clubs, forming communities, supporting each other. They saw the beginning of something they couldn't control, so they fought back the only way they knew how, with medicine, with science, with official-sounding diagnoses and grave warnings published in respectable journals. They hoped that women's supposed vanity would keep them off bicycles. After all, what woman would risk becoming permanently ugly? But here's what they didn't count on. Women were tired. Tired of being confined, tired of being controlled, tired of having every aspect of their lives dictated by men who claimed to know what was best for them. And for many women, the promise of freedom was worth more than the promise of beauty. Dr. Sarah Hackett Stevenson, one of the few female physicians of the era, finally debunked the bicycle face myth in 1897. Writing in the Phrenological Journal, she stated plainly, "Cycling is not injurious to any part of the anatomy, as it improves the general health. The painfully anxious facial expression is seen only among beginners, and is due to the uncertainty of amateurs. As soon as a rider becomes proficient, can gauge her muscular strength, and acquires a perfect confidence in her ability to balance herself and her power of locomotion, this look passes away. In other words, people look concentrated when they're learning something new. Once they've mastered it, they relax. This is not a disease. This is not a disfigurement. This is just what learning looks like." But it took a female doctor to point out what should have been blindingly obvious to everyone all along. The bicycle face scare lasted only a few years. By the early 1900s, it had been largely forgotten. Why? Not because doctors admitted they were wrong, not because society apologized for the fear campaign, but because so many women had ridden bicycles without developing permanent facial disfigurement that the lie simply couldn't be sustained anymore. But the damage had been done. For those crucial years in the 1890s when the bicycle was new and exciting and revolutionary, when women were just beginning to taste real freedom of movement, the medical establishment had thrown up yet another barrier. They'd tried to convince women that their own empowerment would make them ugly, that independence came at the cost of femininity, that freedom would literally change their faces into something monstrous. And some women believed it. Some women stayed home. Some women never learned to ride. Some women missed out on one of the great liberating technologies of their age, because doctors told them it would ruin their appearance. Think about that for a moment. Think about all the women who never experienced the joy of cycling because they were afraid of bicycle face. Think about the mobility they never had, the places they never went, the independence they never tasted, all because of a made-up disease that existed only in the minds of men who couldn't stand the sight of women being free. The bicycle face is gone now. We laugh at it. We shake our heads at how ridiculous people were back then. But while we're laughing, let's remember what it really was. It was a weapon, a tool of control, a way to use women's socialization, their training to value beauty and femininity above all else, against them, a way to make them police their own freedom. And here's the uncomfortable truth. While bicycle face might be gone, the impulse behind it isn't. We still see medical and scientific authorities making claims about women's bodies that just happen to align perfectly with keeping women in their place. We still see warnings about what will happen if women push too hard, work too much, want too much. The language changes, the specific concerns evolve, but the underlying message remains the same. Stay in your lane or something terrible will happen to you. The women who rode bicycles despite the warnings, despite the mockery, despite the threats about bicycle face, they weren't just enjoying a new form of transportation. They were pioneers. They were rebels. They were women who looked at the supposed authority of medical science and said, "I don't believe you." They were women who valued freedom more than beauty, independence more than social approval. And every time you see a woman riding a bicycle today, every time you hop on a bike yourself, you're benefiting from their courage, from their willingness to risk the dreaded bicycle face, from their refusal to let fear keep them confined. But the Victorian panic about female independence didn't stop with bicycles. Because coming up next, we're going to talk about another existential threat to women's health and well-being. An activity so dangerous, so damaging that doctors claimed it could lead to madness, moral decay, and the complete destruction of a woman's mind. What was this terrifying activity? Reading novels? Yes, really. Victorian doctors believed that women reading fiction was a serious medical concern, and the reasons why tell us everything we need to know about how society viewed women's minds. So take a deep breath, maybe adjust your pillow again, because we're about to dive into the bizarre world of Victorian medicine once more, where books were considered more dangerous than any disease. Imagine, if you will, a young woman sitting by the window. Sunlight streams through the glass, illuminating her face as she turns the pages of a book. Her eyes move across the lines of text. Her breathing slows. She's completely absorbed in the story unfolding before her. And watching her, a Victorian doctor feels genuine alarm. Not because she's reading something dangerous or subversive. Not because the book contains radical ideas or forbidden knowledge, but simply because she's reading fiction. And according to the medical wisdom of the time, this innocent activity was slowly destroying her mind. The year is 1864. A religious tract published in New York contains a warning so dire, so urgent that it spans nearly 350 pages. The author, writing anonymously so he could, quote, write with more freedom, had witnessed something he needed the world to know about. He'd seen the devastating effects of a habit that was destroying the health, the minds, and the very souls of women across the nation. Evil reading. He wrote, and I want you to hear this carefully, that the minds of novel readers are intoxicated, their rest is broken, their health shattered, and their prospect of usefulness blighted. According to this anonymous pastor, reading fiction was as dangerous as any disease. More dangerous, perhaps, because it attacked slowly, insidiously, until the damage was irreversible. And he wasn't alone in this belief, not by a long shot. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, that Kellogg, the man who gave us cornflakes, had very strong opinions about women reading novels. In his 1882 book, Ladies' Guide in Health and Disease, he devoted an entire section to this supposedly pernicious habit. He wrote that novel reading was one of the most pernicious habits to which a young lady can be devoted. When the habit is once thoroughly fixed, he claimed, it becomes as inveterate as the use of liquor or opium. Let me repeat that. This doctor, this respected medical professional, genuinely believed that reading novels was as addictive as alcohol or opium. That once a woman started reading fiction, she'd become enslaved by it, unable to stop, her entire life consumed by this terrible compulsion. But Kellogg didn't stop there. He went on to make an even more extraordinary claim. He stated, and I'm quoting directly here, We firmly believe that the practice of novel reading is one of the greatest causes of uterine disease in young women. Uterine disease. From reading books, not from poor nutrition, not from lack of medical care, not from the actual physical conditions that cause reproductive health problems. No, according to Dr. Kellogg, the womb itself was damaged by exposure to fictional narratives. Now, before you start laughing, and I know the temptation is strong, think about what this really means. Think about what these men were actually saying. They were claiming that women's bodies, specifically their reproductive organs, could be harmed by thoughts, by imagination, by engaging with stories. And why? What was it about fiction that was so terrifying? Well, Kellogg provided some hints. He warned that popular novels contained matter of a directly depraving character, presented in such gilded form and specious guise that the work of contamination may be completed before suspicion is aroused. In other words, novels were sneaky. They made bad ideas seem good. They contaminated women's minds without them even realizing it was happening. The concern went back even further than Kellogg. In 1797, nearly a century earlier, a British journal published an article with a title that left no room for ambiguity: Novel Reading, a Cause of Female Depravity. The author claimed to have personally witnessed the moral decay of several young female readers. He'd seen respectable young women transformed into morally corrupt beings, all because they'd developed the habit of reading fiction. But what did they mean by moral decay? What exactly were they afraid would happen to women who read novels? The answer is fascinating, and it tells us everything about what Victorian society really feared. See, when you read a novel, something remarkable happens. You step into someone else's life. You experience their thoughts, their desires, their choices. You imagine possibilities that don't exist in your own world. You develop empathy for people who are different from you. You start to question whether the way things are is the way things have to be. And for Victorian women trapped in lives where every choice was made for them, where their entire existence was prescribed from birth to death, this was revolutionary. Novels showed them that other ways of living were possible, that women in other places, other times, even just in the author's imagination, made their own decisions, fell in love with people they chose, had adventures, expressed opinions, lived. Charlotte Mason, a homeschooling pioneer, wrote in 1886 that the girl who sits for hours poring over a novel, to the damage of her eyes, her brain, and her general nervous system, is guilty of a lesser fault of the nature of suicide. Suicide. She literally compared reading to killing yourself, and notice what she mentions: eyes, brain, general nervous system. The medical establishment had convinced people that reading fiction caused physical damage, that the act of absorbing a story through your eyes and processing it in your brain was harmful to the body. The symptoms they described were remarkably similar to those of hysteria: nervousness, insomnia, loss of appetite, irritability, an unhealthy fixation on imaginary scenarios, daydreaming, the inability to focus on proper useful tasks, a tendency to have ideas. There was even a documented case reported by a physician of a woman who became, in his words, incurably insane from reading novels. Incurably insane. The doctor stated this with absolute certainty. He'd examined her, taken her history, and determined that her madness had one single cause: books. Now, let's think about this critically for a moment. Have you ever heard of anyone, anywhere, at any time in history, actually going insane from reading fiction? Of course not. That's not how brains work. That's not how mental illness works. Reading doesn't damage your nervous system. It doesn't harm your reproductive organs. It doesn't make you crazy. But here's what reading does do, especially if you're a woman in Victorian society. It gives you ideas. It shows you alternative ways of living. It makes you think. It makes you question. It makes you want. And that was the real danger. Not to women's health, but to the social order that kept them confined. The medical establishment was very specific about what kinds of books were acceptable for women. History was fine, biography was fine. Religious texts obviously were encouraged. Even novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which dealt with serious moral issues in a straightforward way, were considered safe. But what about romantic novels, adventure stories, gothic mysteries, sensation fiction? No, absolutely not. Those books contained depraved characters. They presented situations that might give young ladies ideas about love, about independence, about stepping outside the narrow boundaries society had drawn for them. The concern about novels was really a concern about imagination, about women developing an internal life that men couldn't control. When a woman read a novel, she was alone with her thoughts. She was entertaining ideas that no one else could monitor or approve. She was, for a few hours at least, free, and Victorian society could not tolerate that freedom. The warnings extended beyond just the content of novels. Doctors cautioned that the very act of reading for pleasure was unhealthy. They distinguished between studying, which required diligent work and effort, and reading, which was effortless pleasure. Women were supposed to work, to put effort into improving themselves according to male-defined standards. But pleasure, entertainment, losing yourself in a story just because you enjoyed it, that was dangerous. One medical text described uncontrolled reading as threatening the social order and harming the individual body. Another compared reading habits to seductions, cravings, abuses, and bodily urges for food, alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. The language they used was language of addiction, of moral failing, of physical corruption. They painted a picture of women whose reading habits had consumed them, women who stayed up all night finishing novels, who neglected their household duties, who preferred the company of fictional characters to real people, women who, horror of horrors, read books instead of spending every waking moment in service to their families. And yes, some Victorian women did read voraciously. They read by candlelight into the small hours of the morning. They hid novels under their pillows. They borrowed books from lending libraries and devoured them in secret. They gathered in reading circles where they could discuss stories with other women, away from male supervision, because novels offered something their real lives didn't. Excitement, romance, agency. In novels, women had adventures, they made choices. They sometimes even had happy endings that didn't involve marriage to a man chosen by their father. The feminist writer Emily Davies noted in 1864 that newspapers are scarcely to be read by women at all. When the Times is offered to a lady, the sheet containing the advertisements and the births, deaths, marriages is considerately selected. Women weren't supposed to read about politics, about business, about the world beyond the domestic sphere. But novels? Novels dealt with emotions, with relationships, with the private sphere that was supposedly woman's natural domain. Except novels also showed women that the private sphere didn't have to be a prison, that love could be a choice, not an obligation, that women could be intelligent, brave, resourceful, independent, and that was terrifying to a society built on female submission. The sensation novels of the 1860s were particularly controversial. Writers like Mary Elizabeth Braddon and Wilkie Collins created female characters who broke all the rules. Women who weren't angels, women who schemed, who wanted things, who refused to be passive, women who sometimes got away with it. Critics were horrified. They called these novels dangerous, corrupting, unwholesome. They warned that young women who read them would lose their innocence, their purity, their simplicity of mind. Because the novels showed that women could be complex, that they could have dark thoughts and strong desires, that they weren't the docile, simple creatures Victorian ideology insisted they were. And when real women started behaving in ways that society found unacceptable, when they demanded education or refused unwanted marriages, or expressed dissatisfaction with their lives, it was convenient to have a scapegoat. It wasn't that women had legitimate grievances, It wasn't that the social system was unjust. No, they'd just been reading too many novels. Their minds had been contaminated by fiction. They couldn't distinguish between fantasy and reality anymore. This diagnosis served multiple purposes. It dismissed women's complaints as irrational. It provided a medical explanation for female discontent. And it gave families a way to control their daughters, wives and sisters. Don't read novels, darling. You know what the doctor said. It'll make you sick. It'll damage your womb. It'll drive you insane. Some women believed it. They felt guilty for the pleasure they took in reading. They worried that their enjoyment of stories was a moral failing. They tried to limit themselves, to read only improving books, to avoid fiction entirely. And in doing so, they denied themselves one of the few sources of joy and imagination available to them. But many women didn't believe it. Or rather, they decided that even if it was true, it was worth the risk. They kept reading, they kept imagining, they kept believing that life could be different than what society had prescribed for them. And slowly, gradually, the world started to change. Because when enough women read enough novels showing them that alternatives existed, they started demanding those alternatives in real life. The novel-reading woman became the suffragette, the educated woman, the woman who refused to accept that her only purpose was marriage and motherhood. By the early 20th century, the warnings about novel reading had mostly faded away. Not because doctors admitted they were wrong, not because society apologized for trying to control women's minds, but because literacy had spread so widely, because novels had become so common, that it became impossible to maintain the fiction that reading them was dangerous. Plus, a funny thing happened. As more women read novels, and as decades passed without an epidemic of novel-induced insanity, people started to notice that maybe, just maybe, the doctors had been wrong. That women's brains were perfectly capable of handling fictional narratives without imploding. That reading didn't actually cause uterine disease or nervous disorders or moral corruption, but the damage had been done. For decades, Victorian society had used medical authority to shame and frighten women away from one of the few intellectual pleasures available to them. They'd medicalize female imagination, turning a harmless joy into a symptom of disease. They'd taken something as innocent as reading a story and transformed it into evidence of moral and physical failing. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. These weren't just random opinions, these were published medical texts, written by doctors, men with degrees and authority and social standing. When Dr. Kellogg said novel reading caused uterine disease, people believed him. When physicians diagnosed women as insane from reading fiction, families committed those women to asylums. The line between social control and medical treatment became completely blurred. If a woman wanted something her family didn't approve of, if she expressed discontent with her life, if she seemed too imaginative or too independent, doctors could point to her reading habits as evidence of illness. And once she was labelled sick, her opinions didn't matter anymore. She needed treatment, not freedom, cure, not choice. The Victorian panic about novel reading shows us something important about how societies use science and medicine to enforce conformity. When you can't directly tell people they're not allowed to do something, you tell them it's dangerous. You find doctors who will agree with you. You publish warnings in respectable journals. You create a medical diagnosis that perfectly describes the behavior you want to eliminate. And if some women suffer for it, well, it's for their own good, isn't it? You're protecting them, helping them, saving them from themselves. Except you're not. You're controlling them. You're limiting their horizons. You're keeping them small and manageable and confined. You're making sure they never imagine anything beyond what you've decided they should have. The novel reading scare is gone now. We don't warn women that fiction will destroy their wombs or drive them mad. We laugh at Dr. Kellogg and his absurd claims. We shake our heads at the Victorian doctors who confused female independence with mental illness. But as we move forward in our journey through Victorian fears, Let me ask you something. Are we really so different today? Do we still use medical and scientific language to police women's choices? Do we still find ways to suggest that when women want something outside their prescribed role, there's something wrong with them? Keep that question in mind, because up next we're going to explore what happened when women didn't just want to read about education, when they actually tried to get one. When women sought to enter universities, Victorian doctors had a whole new set of terrifying predictions about what would happen to the female body under the strain of learning. And the theories they developed about women's brains and reproductive organs competing for blood supply, well, let's just say it makes the novel reading panic look almost reasonable by comparison. So settle in, maybe put down that novel you're reading if you're worried about your uterus. Though honestly, at this point, I think we can safely say your organs are fine. It's the ideas those novels might give you that Victorian society was really afraid of. And those ideas, those are dangerous still, in the best possible way. There's a particular kind of photograph from the Victorian era that always catches my attention. It shows a young woman in academic dress standing in a library, holding a book. She looks serious, intelligent, determined, and in the background, if you look closely at the date, you'll realize this photograph represents something revolutionary, something that, according to the medical establishment of the time, should have been impossible, because that woman, standing there with her book and her degree, should have been dead, or at the very least infertile, insane, and physically deformed. At least that's what Dr. Edward Hammond Clark said would happen. In 1873, this Harvard Medical School professor published a book that became an instant bestseller. It sold out in a single week. The title, Sex in Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls. And despite that seemingly progressive title, the book's message was anything but fair. Clark argued, with the full weight of his medical authority behind him, that women who pursued higher education were committing a form of biological suicide. His theory was simple, elegant, and completely wrong, but it was also absolutely terrifying to anyone who believed in women's potential. Clark claimed that the human body contained a finite amount of energy. This energy, he said, could be directed to different parts of the body, but there was only so much to go around, like a budget that had to be carefully managed. And in women, this energy budget faced a unique challenge. During puberty, Clark explained, a girl's body needed to direct enormous amounts of energy to developing her reproductive organs, her ovaries, her uterus, all the internal machinery necessary for her to fulfill what he considered her primary purpose, becoming a mother. This development, he insisted, required virtually all of her available energy, which meant that if a girl diverted that energy elsewhere, say, to her brain through intensive studying, there simply wouldn't be enough left over for her reproductive system to develop properly. The result, Clark warned, would be catastrophic. He wrote that women who engaged in sustained vigorous mental activity, who studied in what he called a boy's way, risked atrophy of the uterus and ovaries, masculinization, sterility, insanity, and even death. Let me repeat that list because it's important you understand how extreme these claims were. Atrophy of reproductive organs, masculinization, sterility, insanity, death, all from studying too hard. Clark was specific about the mechanisms. If a girl spent too much time reading, writing, doing mathematics, or engaging in any intellectual labor, blood would rush to her brain to support this mental work. And that blood, he claimed, would be diverted away from her reproductive organs, starving them of the nutrients they needed to develop. The result would be what he described as monstrous brains and puny bodies, women with overdeveloped intellects and underdeveloped wombs. He even provided guidelines. Women should study no more than 4 hours per day. They should study separately from boys because the competitive environment of coeducation would drive them to overexert themselves. And here's the part that really shows you what this was about. He insisted that women should avoid studying entirely during menstruation. Every 4th week, he said, they should rest completely, no books, no thinking, just rest. To support his claims, Clark presented case studies. 7 women, he said, whose health had deteriorated as a direct result of their arduous studies in college. He described them in vivid, alarming detail. Young women who had been healthy before college, but who graduated, if they graduated at all, as invalids. Women whose menstrual cycles had been disrupted. Women who suffered from what he called nervous collapse. Women who would never be able to bear children. And people believed him, not just a few people, thousands upon thousands of people. The book went through multiple printings. It was discussed in parlours and lecture halls across the country. State legislatures used it to justify banning girls from competitive sports. For decades after its publication, Clark's theories influenced educational policy. But here's what Clark didn't mention, or perhaps didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore. His case studies were anecdotal. He had no experimental evidence, no control groups, no actual scientific methodology. He'd simply found 7 women who had health problems and happened to have attended college, and decided that the college must have caused the health problems. It's the same logic that would blame umbrellas for rain, just because people tend to carry them when it's raining. Moreover, Clark completely ignored all the women who'd gone to college and were perfectly healthy. He ignored the women who had graduated, gotten married, had children, and lived long, productive lives. He ignored any evidence that contradicted his predetermined conclusion, because the conclusion came first. Clark already believed that women shouldn't pursue higher education. He believed their place was in the home. He believed that women were fundamentally different from men in ways that made them unsuited for intellectual work. And then he looked for medical reasons to support what he already wanted to be true. The book caused immediate controversy. Women's rights activists were outraged, and among them was a brilliant young physician named Mary Putnam Jacobi. She'd already accomplished things that Clark insisted were impossible. She was the first woman admitted to study medicine at the University of Paris, the first woman to graduate from a pharmacy college in the United States. She had, in other words, devoted enormous energy to developing her brain, and somehow, miraculously by Clark's standards, she was still alive and healthy. Jacobi read Clark's book and was appalled, not just by the conclusions, but by the complete lack of actual science behind them. So she decided to do what Clark had failed to do, actual research. In 1874, she published an essay called Mental Action and Physical Health, which appeared in a collection titled The Education of American Girls. In it, she systematically dismantled Clark's arguments. She attacked his reasoning about disease causation. She questioned his knowledge of physiology. She pointed out his complete lack of experimental evidence. She demonstrated with precision and clarity that Clark's theories were based on assumption and prejudice, not science. But she didn't stop there. In 1874, the Harvard-Boylston Medical Society, comprised of Boston's medical elite, announced the topic for their prestigious prize competition. The question they posed was this: do women require mental and bodily rest during menstruation, and to what extent? You can imagine what they expected the answer to be. This was Harvard, after all, the same institution where Clark had been a professor. They were asking the question because they expected someone to provide scientific support for Clark's theories, to prove, once and for all, that women needed rest during their periods. That intellectual work during menstruation was dangerous. Leaders of the feminist movement approached Jacobi and asked her to submit an essay. She agreed, but she didn't just write an opinion piece. She conducted actual scientific research, extensive, rigorous research that would put Clark's anecdotal observations to shame. Jacobi studied hundreds of women, rich and poor, rural and urban, different education levels, different occupations. She didn't cherry-pick cases that supported her hypothesis. She looked at the full range of women's experiences. She and her colleagues at the New York Infirmary for Women and Children conducted experiments. They did blood tests, urine tests. They had women use exercise machines at different points in their menstrual cycles, measuring their strength and endurance. They tracked body temperatures throughout the month. It was through this temperature tracking, by the way, that Jacobi made a discovery that would later lead to the rhythm method of family planning. She found that ovulation could be indicated by changes in body temperature, but that was just a side benefit of her research. The main question was whether menstruation required rest, whether women were incapacitated by their monthly cycles, whether intellectual work during this time was dangerous. And what did Jacobi find? She found, and I'm quoting her conclusions here, that there is nothing in the nature of menstruation to imply the necessity or even desirability of rest. She found that women were healthy when they were educated, mentally engaged, and physically active. She found that social limitations, not biology, threatened women and constrained their health. In 1876, Jacobi submitted her essay anonymously to the Boylston Prize competition. She even had a male friend copy it out in masculine handwriting because she knew that if the judges saw feminine handwriting, they might be biased against it. And she won. She became the first woman ever to win the Harvard Boylston Prize. At Harvard, the same institution that had employed Edward Clark, the same institution that wouldn't admit female students for another 69 years. Let that irony sink in for a moment. Harvard gave its prestigious medical prize to a woman who had proven that their professor's theories about women were complete nonsense. They gave it to her anonymously, not knowing she was a woman. And when they discovered who had won, they had to honor their decision. They had to admit that the science supported women's education, not Clark's scare tactics. But did this change things overnight? Did universities suddenly throw open their doors to women? Did society apologize for decades of discouraging girls from learning? Of course not. Clark's ideas persisted, even after Jacobi thoroughly debunked them. Even after it became clear that thousands of women were pursuing higher education without dropping dead or losing their fertility. The beliefs were too useful, too convenient, for them to be abandoned just because they were wrong. Universities continued to discriminate against female students. Oxford didn't grant degrees to women until 1920. Cambridge held out until 1948. Almost the middle of the 20th century before one of the world's most prestigious universities would officially recognize that women could earn degrees without their ovaries shriveling up, and the excuses kept coming. If it wasn't about blood flow and energy, it was about something else. Some doctors claimed that women's brains were simply smaller than men's and therefore less capable. Others suggested that intellectual work would make women masculine, that their features would become harsh and unattractive, that studying would interfere with their natural feminine grace and make them unsuitable for marriage. The image of the female college graduate as unappealing, as somehow less of a woman, persisted well into the 20th century. She was depicted in cartoons and novels as bespectacled, stern and unmarriageable. The word bluestocking, originally neutral, became an insult. A bluestocking was a woman who cared more about books than about her appearance or her domestic duties. She was unnatural, unfeminine, wrong. Smith College, when it opened its doors in 1875, just 2 years after Clark's book, felt the need to reassure parents. The president announced that it was founded to preserve women's womanliness. The message was clear. Yes, we'll educate your daughters, but don't worry, they'll still be feminine. They'll still be suitable for marriage. We won't turn them into those terrifying intellectual monsters that Clark warned about. It's darkly funny when you think about it. These institutions had to promise that education wouldn't damage women, as if knowledge itself were some kind of toxic substance that needed to be administered carefully, in small doses, to avoid permanent harm. And underneath all of this, underneath every medical theory and educational policy and social expectation was was one fundamental fear. The fear that educated women would want something other than marriage and motherhood, that they would have options, that they would be independent, that they would choose. Because here's the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. Women with education don't need to marry for financial security. Women with professional skills can support themselves. Women who've tasted intellectual freedom don't easily accept lives of domestic confinement. Education wasn't dangerous to women's reproductive organs. It was dangerous to a social system built on female dependence. Clarke knew this. That's why he framed it as concern for women's health. That's why he used medical language and anatomical diagrams and scientific-sounding theories. Because you can't just say, I don't want women to have the same opportunities as men because then they won't need us. That sounds petty. That sounds like exactly what it is, which is the protection of male privilege. But if you say, I'm worried about women's health, I'm concerned that education will damage their reproductive capacity, I'm trying to protect them from harming themselves, well, that sounds noble. That sounds like care. That sounds like science. It wasn't science, it was fear dressed up in a lab coat. And the women who saw through it, women like Mary Putnam Jacobi, women who pursued education despite the warnings, despite the social censure, despite being told that they were destroying themselves, those women were heroes. They risked everything, their reputations, their marriage prospects, their acceptance in society, because they believed that their minds mattered, that their potential was worth developing, that being fully human was more important than being perfectly feminine. Some of them paid a price, not the price Clarke predicted. They didn't become infertile or insane or dead, but they did face discrimination. They struggled to find work after graduation because professional positions were closed to women. They were passed over for promotions and awards. Their accomplishments were minimized or attributed to men. They had to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. But they persisted. And gradually, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the world changed. Not because men like Clarke suddenly saw the light, but because enough women proved them wrong simply by existing, by getting educated and staying healthy, by having both careers and families, by demonstrating that the human brain is not in competition with the human reproductive system for resources. Today we look back at Clarke's theories and we laugh. Monstrous brains and puny bodies, blood rushing to the brain and starving the ovaries, women needing to rest entirely during menstruation. It sounds absurd. It sounds like something from a satirical novel, not a serious medical text. But while we're laughing, let's also remember, these ideas didn't exist in a vacuum. They were part of a systematic effort to keep women out of higher education. And they worked. For decades they worked. Countless women were discouraged from pursuing their intellectual potential because authority figures, people with medical degrees and professional credentials, told them it was dangerous. How many brilliant minds were lost? How many potential doctors, scientists, writers, thinkers never got the chance to develop their talents because they were convinced that studying would ruin them? We'll never know, but the number isn't zero. And as we continue our journey through Victorian fears about female independence, I want you to keep something in mind. Every single one of these fears, from the wandering womb to bicycle face to novel reading to educational damage, they all share something in common. They're all based on the fundamental assumption that women are fragile, that they can't handle freedom, that they need to be protected from themselves. But what we're going to see next is what happened when women didn't just want education or mobility or intellectual stimulation. What happened when they wanted actual legal power, when they wanted to own property, to control their own money, to make decisions about their own lives. Because coming up, we're going to talk about one of the most bizarre legal doctrines in English history. A doctrine that declared that when a woman married, she ceased to exist as a separate legal person. And the medical and philosophical justifications for this? Well, they make Clarke's theories about wombs and brains seem almost reasonable by comparison. Rest your eyes for a moment. Let the absurdity of it all wash over you. And when you're ready, we'll dive into the strange world of coverture, where women became legally dead upon marriage, and where the fear of female economic independence created some of the most Byzantine property laws ever devised. What if I told you that there was a time when a woman could wake up one morning as a full person with rights, property, and a legal identity, and by the end of that same day, after saying 2 words at an altar, she would cease to exist? Not physically, of course. She'd still be breathing, walking, talking, but legally she would have vanished, absorbed, erased, merged into another person, like a drop of water disappearing into the ocean. This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't some dystopian nightmare from a novel. This was English common law. This was how marriage actually worked for hundreds of years. And the name for this legal disappearing act, coverture. Sir William Blackstone, in his massively influential Commentaries on the Laws of England, published in 1765, explained it with stunning clarity. He wrote, and these words would shape the lives of millions of women for generations. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Read that again. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended. Suspended. As if she were a painting taken down from the wall and stored in a closet. As if she were a book closed and placed on a shelf. She still existed, yes, but not as herself, not as a person. She existed only as part of her husband, under his cover, hence coverture. And here's the kicker. Blackstone presented this as something beautiful, something protective. He described the husband's authority as a wing, under which the wife performed everything. He called her femme covert, which in French means covered woman, protected woman, safe woman. The language made it sound like marriage was wrapping women in a warm blanket, shielding them from the harsh world. But let's talk about what this really meant in practice, what it actually felt like to be covered. When a woman married, everything she owned became her husband's property. Her money, her land, her jewellery, her clothes, the furniture in her home. If she had a business, it was his now. If she earned wages, they belonged to him. If someone owed her a debt, he could collect it. And she had no legal right to stop him from doing any of this. No right to object, no right to negotiate, because she wasn't a person who could have rights. Think about that for a moment. Imagine working your entire life, building up savings, inheriting property from your family. And then, the moment you marry, all of it simply transfers to someone else. You retain no control over it. You can't sell it without his permission. You can't give it away. You can't even decide what happens to it after you die. Your will means nothing if your husband disagrees with it. One legal commentator at the time said it plainly. Married women held the same legal status as criminals, minors, and the insane. They couldn't enter into contracts. They couldn't sue anyone in court without their husband joining the lawsuit, and if someone needed to sue them, they had to sue the husband instead, because the wife wasn't a legal entity capable of being sued. Now, you might be thinking, surely this protected women from debt, right? If they couldn't make contracts, at least they couldn't get into financial trouble. Except, no. Because while a wife couldn't incur her own debts, she also became responsible for her husband's debts. If he owed money when they married, those debts became hers too. If he made poor financial decisions during the marriage, if he gambled, if he invested badly, if he simply spent recklessly, she had to live with the consequences. She had no power to stop him, but she suffered alongside him. And here's something truly bizarre. Under coverture, The law assumed that a married woman never acted independently. If she committed a crime, the law assumed she must have done it under her husband's direction. After all, she had no will of her own. She was covered by him, therefore he directed her actions. The law even gave him the right to physically punish her with moderate correction, the delicate term used for domestic violence. But wait, you might say. What about cases where the husband was abusive or incompetent? What about women who needed protection from their husbands, not by their husbands? Well, that was too bad, because the law didn't really provide for that. The husband and wife were one person, and that one person's was the husband. A legal scholar later paraphrased it perfectly. Though the husband and wife are one, the one is the husband. Now, wealthy families found ways around some of this. They created something called a marriage settlement through equity courts. Before the wedding, a woman's father could set up a trust that held her property separately, managed by trustees. The property would be designated for her sole and separate use, protected from her future husband's control and his creditors. But this required legal expertise, money for lawyers, and a father who actually cared about protecting his daughter's interests. Most women had none of these things. For the vast majority of women, coverture meant exactly what it said: complete legal absorption into their husband's identity. And the justifications for this system, oh, they were remarkable in their creativity and their absurdity. Some said it was based on biblical doctrine, the idea of husband and wife becoming one flesh. Never mind that spiritual unity and legal erasure are completely different concepts. The Bible was invoked to make it seem sacred and unchangeable. Others claimed it was for women's protection, that women were too delicate, too unworldly, too emotional to handle property and legal matters, that men, as natural protectors, should manage everything for them. Better to have no control at all than to make a mistake, right? Still others argued it was about family unity, that a household needed one head, one decision-maker, or chaos would result. Two people couldn't possibly negotiate and compromise about money. Better to simply give all the power to one person and have done with it. But here's what they didn't like to talk about. Coverture wasn't actually about protection. It was about control. It was about ensuring that women remained economically dependent on men. Because a woman with money is a woman with options. A woman who can support herself can leave a bad marriage, can refuse an unwanted proposal, can make her own choices about her life. And that was terrifying to a society built on female dependence. If women could own property, they wouldn't have to marry for financial security. They could wait for love, or choose not to marry at all. They could leave husbands who abused them. They could support their children independently. They could have power. The fear of women with economic power ran deep. You can see it in the language used to describe women who worked or who managed money. They were unnatural, unfeminine, stepping outside their proper sphere. Even when women were widowed and had to manage estates and businesses to survive, they were viewed with suspicion. A woman handling money was seen as almost indecent. And divorce. Under coverture, divorce was nearly impossible for women to obtain. A man could divorce his wife for simple adultery. But a woman, she had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, bigamy, or incest. And even if she could prove all that, she still needed money to pay for the legal proceedings. Money that belonged to her husband. Money he certainly wasn't going to give her to use against him in court. Plus, if she did manage to get divorced, what then? Any property acquired during the marriage was his. Any wages she'd earned were his. Her children, also his. The law gave fathers automatic custody. A divorced or separated woman could be left with literally nothing. No money, no property, no children, and society would blame her for it, because obviously, if her marriage failed, it must have been her fault. This is why the Married Women's Property Acts, when they finally came, were so revolutionary. The first one, passed in 1870, allowed women to keep their own earnings, not inheritance, not property they brought to the marriage, just what they earned through their own work. It seems like such a basic right, doesn't it? The idea that money you earn through your own labour should belong to you. But for married women in 1870, this was radical, this was unprecedented, this changed everything. The 1882 Act went further. It allowed women to retain what they owned at the time of marriage. It gave married women the right to own property, to enter contracts, to sue and be sued in their own names. It essentially said that married women were, in fact, persons under the law. The resistance to these acts was fierce. Opponents argued that they would destroy the family, that they would encourage women to be selfish, that they would remove men's incentive to work hard if they couldn't control their wives' property. One opponent actually wrote a pamphlet titled, "Why Women Cannot Be Turned into Men," as if giving women property rights was the same as changing their biological sex. The arguments against women's property rights reveal so much about Victorian fears. They weren't really worried about family unity or feminine delicacy. They were worried about losing control, about women having the power to say no, about marriages where women were partners rather than possessions. Because here's what property rights really meant. They meant a woman could inherit her grandmother's house and keep it, even if her husband wanted to sell it. They meant a woman who wrote novels could keep the money she earned from them. They meant a woman could save money from her wages and use it to leave an abusive marriage. They meant women became people in the eyes of the law. And once women became people in legal terms, once they could own property and make contracts and manage their own affairs, a funny thing happened. They started wanting other rights too. Political rights, educational rights, the right to vote. Because if you're capable of managing property and contracts, then clearly you're capable of casting a ballot. If you're responsible enough to own a business, then surely you're responsible enough to have a say in who makes the laws. The path from property rights to suffrage was direct and inevitable, and the men who opposed the Property Acts knew it. That's why they fought so hard. That's why they used the same language of protection and natural order and family stability that they'd used to justify every other restriction on women. But the Acts passed anyway, not because men suddenly became enlightened, not because society collectively decided that fairness mattered, but because enough women and their allies pushed hard enough, argued loud enough, and refused to accept the status quo. And also, frankly, because some men realized that when their wives had property rights, it actually helped their families. A wife's separate property could protect the family if the husband's business failed or his creditors came calling. Still, the psychological legacy of coverure persisted long after the legal doctrine was abolished. The idea that a woman's identity merges with her husband's when she marries, that his name replaces hers, that his career comes first, that his money is family money while her money is her own money, meaning somehow less important. These ideas didn't die with the Property Acts, they evolved. They became customs instead of laws, expectations instead of requirements, but they still limited women's lives. Even today we see echoes of coverture, in the assumption that married women will change their names, in the wage gap between married and unmarried women, in the career penalties women face after marriage and childbirth while men receive a marriage bonus, in the way people still talk about women who don't take their husbands' names as making a statement, as if keeping your own identity requires justification. The horror of women owning property wasn't really about property at all, it was about power, about autonomy, about the fundamental question of whether women were full human beings or partial ones, whether they were persons in their own right or appendages to men, whether they deserved to control their own lives or needed to be controlled for their own good. Coverture answered that question clearly. Women were not persons, they were covered, protected, controlled, owned, and for centuries that answer was written into law, enforced by courts and justified by medicine, religion, and social custom. But here's the thing about legal fictions. They only work as long as enough people agree to pretend they're true. And eventually enough women stopped pretending, stopped accepting, stopped agreeing that their legal erasure was for their own benefit. They demanded to be persons. They demanded to own property. They demanded to exist as separate human beings even after marriage. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, the law had to acknowledge what should have been obvious all along, that women are people, that marriage doesn't erase personhood, that love and partnership don't require one person to legally cease to exist. Yet as we journey deeper into Victorian anxieties, we're going to discover that even as women gained property rights, even as they became legal persons, society found new ways to police female independence. Because coming up next, we're going to talk about something that might seem trivial compared to legal erasure or medical theories. We're going to talk about pants, or rather, about the absolute social panic that erupted when women dared to wear them. Because if coverture was about legal control and medical theories were about biological control, then clothing regulations were about visual control, about making sure that even if a woman had rights, she still looked properly feminine, still looked like someone who knew her place. And the story of bloomers and dress reform, it's wilder than you might imagine. So take a breath, rest for a moment, and prepare yourself for the scandal of women in trousers. Picture a quiet spring morning in 1851. The streets of Seneca Falls, New York, are going about their usual business. Shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, horses clopping along the cobblestones, and then suddenly, 3 women step out onto Main Street wearing something that makes the entire town stop in its tracks. They're wearing pants. Well, sort of. Loose Turkish-style trousers gathered at the ankle, topped with a knee-length skirt, still covering them completely from neck to toe, still perfectly modest by any reasonable standard. But the reaction, you'd have thought they'd walked out naked. Men stopped mid-conversation, mouths hanging open. Women gasped, children pointed, and within minutes a crowd had gathered, following the 3 women down the street, shouting, laughing, jeering. What had they done that was so shocking? They'd simply decided that maybe, just maybe, women deserved to wear clothing that didn't weigh 30 pounds, didn't drag through mud and horse manure, didn't require 6 petticoats underneath, and didn't risk catching fire every time you walked past a stove. The 3 women were Elizabeth Smith Miller, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Amelia Bloomer. And this simple walk down a street in Seneca Falls would trigger one of the most intense fashion panics in American history. Elizabeth Smith Miller had created the outfit out of pure frustration. She was trying to garden, trying to do actual physical work, and her floor-length skirts kept getting in the way, dragging through the dirt, catching on plants, becoming soaked and heavy. In a moment of exasperation, she later wrote, "This shackle should no longer be endured," so she designed something practical. Turkish trousers to the ankle with the skirt reaching some 4 inches below the knee. Comfortable, functional, revolutionary. When she visited her cousin Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Seneca Falls, Stanton saw her outfit and immediately understood its significance. She wrote that watching her cousin carry a lamp in one hand and a baby in the other, walking upstairs with ease and grace, while she herself, in flowing robes, had to pull herself up with difficulty, lamp and baby out of the question, convinced her that there was sore need of reform in woman's dress. Stanton made herself an identical outfit. Their neighbour Amelia Bloomer, editor of The Lily, the first newspaper owned, operated, and edited by a woman, joined them. And in April of 1851, Bloomer published articles about this new freedom dress in her paper. She included sketches. She described the practical benefits. She advocated for women to adopt this sensible alternative to the heavy, constricting dresses that were literally damaging their health. And all hell broke loose. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Some initial responses were curious, even positive. The New York Tribune described a beautiful bloomer worn by a young woman, but that positive coverage didn't last. Within weeks, the costume that women were calling reform dress or freedom dress was being mocked as bloomers, named derisively after Amelia Bloomer, even though she hadn't invented it. The backlash was swift and vicious. Magazines called it a sort of she-male dress. Cartoonists drew women in bloomers smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, acting as policemen, or dominating their husbands, who were shown wearing aprons and doing housework. One particularly paranoid cartoon claimed that if women wore pants, men would soon have no right to wear pants at all, as if trousers were a finite resource that could only be allocated to one gender at a time. Ministers preached against bloomers from pulpits, calling them a usurpation of male authority. Medical authorities warned that women wearing pants would become masculinized. Social commentators declared that the bloomer costume would destroy the family, corrupt morals, and lead to the collapse of civilization itself, all because of some loose trousers under a knee-length skirt. But the worst part wasn't the criticism in newspapers or the sermons. It was what happened to women who actually dared to wear bloomers in public. They were followed by mobs, harassed on the streets, shouted at, laughed at, stared at. Boys would throw things, men would make crude comments and aspersions on their character. A London correspondent reported in November of 1851 that women in bloomers are rarely seen in the streets, one reason being that the unlucky wearer of bloomer attire has an excellent chance of being mobbed for her temerity. Think about that. Mobbed for wearing pants, for choosing clothing that was more comfortable and practical, for wanting to walk down the street without your skirt sweeping up horse manure and spreading disease. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's own sons refused to be seen with her in public when she wore bloomers. Her father banned her from wearing them at his house. Her sister actually wept over it. Men threatened that they would not vote for anyone whose wife wore the bloomers. Stanton's husband Henry faced political pressure because his wife insisted on wearing practical clothing. Lucy Stone, one of America's most famous orators for women's rights, wore bloomers while lecturing across 20 states between 1851 and 1855. She had initially adopted them as a health measure while recovering from typhoid fever. But the harassment was relentless. She later lamented, "We put the dress on for greater freedom, but what is physical freedom compared with mental bondage?" And that's the heartbreaking part. These women had genuinely felt liberated by the new costume. Stanton described feeling like a captive set free from his ball and chain. Bloomer praised the lightness and comfort. For the first time in their lives, they could move freely, climb stairs easily, walk in bad weather without becoming drenched, work in gardens, pick up children, live active lives without being weighed down by pounds of fabric. But the social cost was too high. By the end of 1853, Stanton had abandoned bloomers. She persuaded Lucy Stone to do the same. Susan B. Anthony, who had been slow to adopt them, continued wearing them only until mid-1854. Even Amelia Bloomer herself, whose name had become synonymous with the costume, eventually gave it up in 1858 when lightweight wire hoop skirts became available as a slightly less oppressive alternative. The last holdout was Elizabeth Smith Miller, who continued wearing her invention until as late as 1861, partly because her father, abolitionist Gerrit Smith, was one of the only prominent men who supported the costume. He wrote that traditional women's garb both marks and makes their impotence. He understood that clothing was power, that restricting women's physical movement restricted their freedom in every other way. But here's the question we need to ask. Why did bloomers provoke such intense fury? They weren't revealing. Women in bloomers were still covered from neck to ankle. They weren't immodest. In fact, bloomers were often more modest than the fashionable dresses of the time, which sometimes revealed shoulders and décolletage. So what was the real threat? The threat was that bloomers were associated with the women's rights movement. The threat was that women who wore bloomers were making a choice. They were rejecting the fashion dictates that came from Paris. They were prioritizing comfort over appearance, function over form, their own well-being over male approval, and that was unacceptable. One activist, Angelina Grimke, understood this perfectly. She wrote with frustration, "If the bloomer costume had come from a Paris milliner, it would have been welcomed in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But as it is the only dress which has ever been adopted from principle, from a desire in woman to fit herself for daily duty, as it is the outbirth of a state of mind which soars above the prevalent idea of the uses of woman, therefore it shocks the taste." It shocked the taste because it came from women's own desires for freedom, because it represented women taking control of their own bodies and their own lives, because it symbolized a rejection of the idea that women existed primarily to be decorative objects. The symbolism of bloomers was enormous. Pants were men's garments. Pants represented mobility, freedom, authority, participation in public life. Women wearing pants were seen as trying to be men, trying to claim male power, trying to reverse the natural order of things. The very same newspapers that praised men for being practical and sensible condemned women for wanting the same thing. And let's talk about what women were actually wearing instead of bloomers. The fashionable dresses of the 1850s required a minimum of 6 petticoats, sometimes more. The skirts were floor-length, sweeping the ground with every step. They picked up dirt, mud, animal waste, disease-causing bacteria. They were fire hazards. Women regularly died from their skirts catching fire while cooking or warming themselves by stoves. The weight of these outfits was crushing, literally 30 pounds or more hanging from your waist all day, every day. The corsets required to support this weight compressed internal organs, displaced ribs, made breathing difficult. Women fainted regularly because they couldn't get enough oxygen. They developed spinal problems, digestive issues, circulation problems. One dress reformer estimated that fashionable clothing was carrying off 140,000 victims annually from consumption due to tight lacing and unnatural compression of the lungs. 140,000 deaths per year from clothing, but bloomers were the threat. Bloomers were the scandal. Bloomers were what shocked people's taste. Do you see the absurdity? Women were literally dying from their clothing, and society's response was, yes, that's fine, that's normal, that's how women should dress. But the moment women tried to wear something practical, something that wouldn't kill them, society erupted in outrage. The bloomer movement also revealed something about which women were allowed to make choices about clothing. Working-class women had always modified their dress for practical work. They hiked up their skirts, wore shorter hemlines, made adaptations. And while they might face some criticism, they didn't face the level of hysteria that middle-class reformers faced. Because working-class women were expected to do physical labour. They weren't trying to make a political point. They were just trying to survive. But middle-class women, educated women, women's rights activists wearing bloomers, that was different. That was a threat. Because these were women who could have chosen to follow fashion, who had the resources to maintain elaborate wardrobes, who were making a deliberate, principled decision to reject conventional femininity. And that rejection, that choice, that autonomy was what society couldn't tolerate. The bloomer movement ultimately failed as a fashion trend. By early 1852 it had mostly faded away, replaced by slightly less oppressive options like the lightweight crinoline. But the associations persisted. For decades afterward, women who wore any kind of trouser-based clothing were labelled as radicals, as unfeminine, as unnatural. The word bloomer itself became an insult. It wasn't until the bicycle craze of the 1890s that women wearing pants became somewhat more acceptable, and even then, it remained controversial. Women didn't win the right to wear pants without facing discrimination until well into the 20th century. Some workplaces didn't allow women to wear pants until the 1970s. The 1970s. Think about that. And even today, we haven't entirely escaped the politics of women's clothing. Every time a female politician wears a pantsuit, it's commented on, analysed, debated. The obsession with what women wear in the political arena continues. As one historian noted, if you wanted something that's continued from 1851 and Amelia Bloomer to the present, it would be the response of people to women in trousers, and perhaps even more narrowly, the response to women who try to enter the political arena while wearing trousers. The Bloomer scandal wasn't really about pants. It was about power. It was about whether women had the right to make decisions about their own bodies, whether they could prioritize their own comfort over male sexual interest, whether they could move freely through the world without being literally weighed down by the expectations of femininity. Every women's rights activist who wore bloomers knew they were making a statement. They knew they would face ridicule. They knew they would be harassed. They wore them anyway, for as long as they could bear it, because they believed that physical freedom was connected to every other kind of freedom, that you couldn't fight for legal rights or political rights or economic rights while you were trapped in 30 pounds of fabric and a corset squeezing your organs. They were right. But the price they paid was high, and the fact that they eventually had to abandon bloomers doesn't mean they failed. It means society failed them. It means the pressure to conform, to be decorative, to be acceptably feminine was so intense that even the bravest women couldn't withstand it forever. But they tried. And in trying, they showed future generations that women's fashion is political, that clothing choices are never just personal, that every time a woman chooses comfort over convention, function over fashion, or autonomy over approval, she's participating in a tradition of resistance that goes back to those three women walking down Main Street in Seneca Falls in the spring of 1851. Now, if you thought the reaction to bloomers was extreme, wait until you hear about what happened when women wanted to ride bicycles, because we're circling back now to that panic we discussed earlier. But this time we're going to look at it through a different lens, the lens of what bicycles actually meant for women's freedom. And yes, there were medical warnings, but there was also something much darker, something that connected directly to fears about women's sexuality, something so absurd and so telling that it deserves its own exploration. Because Victorian society didn't just fear women on bicycles, they feared what women might do with bicycles, and their imaginations ran absolutely wild. Close your eyes for just a moment. Rest, and when you're ready, we'll explore the most bizarre Victorian panic yet. Remember when I said Victorian society's bicycle panic went beyond just bicycle face and women's mobility? Well, hold on to your seats, because we're about to discuss something that makes those fears look positively tame. Something that reveals just how deeply Victorian society feared women experiencing any form of physical pleasure. Something so absurd that it seems almost impossible that serious medical professionals actually believed it. They genuinely, truly, earnestly believed that bicycle saddles were teaching women how to masturbate. Yes, you heard that correctly. Medical doctors, publishing in respected journals, warned the public that the bicycle saddle was a masturbation machine, that women riding bicycles were secretly using their saddles to achieve sexual arousal, that the very act of sitting on a bicycle seat, legs astride, body in motion, was a pathway to moral corruption and physical ruin. Let me read you what one physician actually wrote in a medical journal, and I want you to remember, as I'm reading this, that this person went to medical school, that he examined patients, that people trusted his medical judgment. He wrote, "The saddle can be tilted in every bicycle as desired. In this way a girl could, by carrying the front peak or pommel high, or by relaxing the stretched leather in order to let it form a deep hammock-like concavity, which would fit itself snugly over the entire vulva and reach up in front, bring about constant friction over the clitoris and labia. This pressure would be much increased by stooping forward, and the warmth generated from vigorous exercise might further increase feeling. The level of detail in that description is remarkable, isn't it? The physician seems to have thought quite extensively about exactly how a woman might use a bicycle saddle for sexual pleasure. One might even say he put more thought into it than most women riders probably did. Because here's the thing. Women weren't riding bicycles for sexual thrills, they were riding bicycles for the same reason men were: to go places, to exercise, to enjoy the freedom of independent transportation, to feel the wind in their faces and the thrill of speed. But Victorian medical authorities simply could not accept that women might ride bicycles for wholesome, practical reasons. The idea that a woman might straddle something, anything, was already suspect. Since the Middle Ages, European women had been expected to ride horses side saddle. Sitting astride was considered masculine, improper, potentially sexually stimulating. And if sitting astride a horse was problematic, imagine how much worse a bicycle saddle must be. Narrower, more focused, with that prominent pommel in front, and all that motion, all that friction, all that warmth generated from vigorous exercise. Doctors became obsessed with female cycling position, the very same posture that in men was praised as efficient and racing ready was condemned in women as evidence of sexual depravity. One physician complained that except when one rides slowly and erect, the whole body's weight rests on the anterior half of the saddle. He warned that the moment speed is desired, the body is bent forward in a characteristic curve and the body's weight is transmitted to the narrow anterior half of the saddle, with all the weight pressing on the perineal region. If a saddle is properly adjusted for slow riding and in an unusual effort at speed or hill climbing, the body is thrown forward, causing the clothing to press against the clitoris, thereby eliciting and arousing feelings hitherto unknown and unrealized by the young maiden. Feelings hitherto unknown and unrealized by the young maiden. Let that phrase sink in. The horror wasn't that these feelings might be uncomfortable or dangerous. The horror was that they were unknown, that young women might discover sensations they hadn't experienced before, that they might, heaven forbid, realize their bodies were capable of pleasure. Another physician was even more direct. He wrote simply bluntly, "The bicycle teaches masturbation in women and girls." Now, before we go any further, we need to understand what masturbation meant to Victorian society. It wasn't just morally wrong, it wasn't simply discouraged. It was considered a medical catastrophe, a form of self-destruction, a path to insanity, disease, and death. Since the early 1800s, medical authorities had warned that masturbation caused tuberculosis, heart disease, epilepsy, blindness, and insanity. One American doctor in the 1880s called it the vilest, the basest, and the most degrading act a human being could commit, something that should make a boy ashamed to look into the eyes of an honest dog. He recommended that parents make unannounced nighttime raids on their children's rooms to catch young masturbators in the act. And the treatments, they were horrifying. Cauterization of the clitoris without anesthesia, clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris, application of caustic chemicals like carbolic acid or silver nitrate to the genitals to create pain and deter touching, metal devices that physically prevented access to one's own body, cold water treatments, electric shocks, institutionalization in asylums. For women especially, any evidence of sexual interest or pleasure could result in diagnosis of hysteria and commitment to psychiatric care. This was the context in which doctors warned about bicycle saddles. They weren't worried about women's comfort or women's health in any genuine sense. They were terrified of women experiencing sexual pleasure, particularly autonomous sexual pleasure that didn't involve a man. That didn't serve reproductive purposes, that was just for the woman's own satisfaction. So they set about trying to prevent it. Bicycle manufacturers responded to medical pressure by creating so-called hygienic saddles. These were saddles designed with little or no padding, where a woman's genitalia would ordinarily make contact with the seat. The idea was to make cycling as uncomfortable as possible, to ensure that women couldn't possibly derive any pleasure from the act, because apparently women's mobility was acceptable only if it was sufficiently unpleasant. They also promoted saddles with high stems and upright handlebars, as opposed to the more aggressive drop handlebars that men used for racing. Women were instructed to ride slowly and sit completely upright. Any leaning forward, any increase in speed, any athletic posture was considered evidence of sexual intent. One physician reported with evident alarm the case of an overwrought, emaciated girl of 15 whose saddle was arranged so that the front pommel rode upward at an angle of about 35 degrees, who stooped forward noticeably in riding, and whose actions strongly suggested the indulgence of masturbation. The girl was overwrought and emaciated, he noted, worn to a frazzle by her fevered indulgence. Never mind that intense physical exercise and poor nutrition might explain her appearance just as well. No, it had to be the bicycle saddle causing her moral and physical decline. The language these doctors used is telling. They wrote about leather being relaxed, creating a hammock-like concavity. They described vulvas resting comfortably. They specified angles of pommels and degrees of forward lean. They detailed exactly how friction might be created, how warmth might be generated, how pressure might be applied, and then they expressed horror that women might experience pleasure from these very specific circumstances that they themselves had described in explicit detail. It's almost as if they were the ones with the obsession, as if they were the ones who couldn't stop thinking about women's bodies and women's pleasure and women's sexuality. As if the real problem wasn't what women were doing, but what men were imagining women might be doing. Because here's what actually happened when women rode bicycles. They rode to work, they rode to visit friends, they rode to run errands, they rode for exercise and fresh air. They rode because it was faster than walking and cheaper than horses. They rode because it gave them independence and freedom and mobility that they had never had before. Some of them probably experienced some pleasant sensations from the motion and friction. So what? Men certainly did, and no one was writing panicked medical treatises about men using bicycles for sexual gratification. But when it came to women, any hint of physical pleasure was a crisis. Any possibility that women might discover their bodies could feel good was an emergency requiring medical intervention. The real fear wasn't about masturbation at all. The real fear was about women's autonomy, about women having experiences that men couldn't control, about women deriving pleasure from something other than male sexual attention. And there's a particular irony here that we need to address. While doctors were warning that bicycle saddles might teach women about sexual pleasure, other doctors were using vibrating devices to give women orgasms as medical treatment for hysteria. That's right, male physicians manually stimulating female patients to orgasm or using mechanical vibrators to do the same was considered legitimate medicine. But a woman choosing to ride a bicycle and possibly experiencing some pleasant sensations, that was a moral catastrophe requiring immediate intervention. It was acceptable for women to experience sexual pleasure if it was administered by a doctor as treatment, if it was something done to them by a male authority figure, if it was medicalized and controlled. But if women sought out their own pleasure, if they engaged in activities that might feel good, if they had any agency over their own physical experiences, unacceptable, dangerous, pathological. The double standard is breathtaking. Men could ride bicycles at racing speeds with aggressive postures and no one worried about their moral character. Men could compete, could sweat, could experience physical exertion and bodily sensations without anyone questioning whether they were using their bicycles inappropriately. But women had to ride slowly, sit upright, use uncomfortable saddles, and constantly monitor themselves for any hint of enjoyment that might be classified as sexual. Moreover, the medical warnings about masturbation teaching bicycles were scientifically absurd even by Victorian standards. If you actually look at modern medical research, doctors today are more concerned that excessive cycling might cause genital numbness by compressing nerves, the opposite of arousal. But Victorian physicians weren't interested in actual physiology. They were interested in controlling women's sexuality. And control it they tried. They wrote articles, they gave lectures, they designed special saddles, they instructed women on proper cycling position. They examined young women for signs of bicycle-induced moral corruption. They warned parents to monitor their daughters' riding habits. They created an entire medical panic around an imaginary problem. But despite all the warnings, despite all the modifications to equipment, despite all the medical surveillance, women kept riding bicycles. They kept experiencing the joy and freedom that cycling offered. And yes, some of them probably did experience pleasant sensations, and perhaps, just perhaps, some of them didn't see that as a problem. Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, wrote a book called A Wheel Within a Wheel about learning to ride a bicycle. She described the exhilaration and health benefits. She never once mentioned using her bicycle for masturbation, probably because, like most women, she was riding it for transportation and exercise, not sexual thrills. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that the bicycle was a tool that motivated women to gain strength and take on increased roles in society. Again, no mention of sexual awakening, just practical benefits and social advancement. And Susan B. Anthony made perhaps the most famous statement about women and bicycles when she said in 1896, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel." Notice that she talked about emancipation, about freedom, about women claiming their place in public space and gaining independence. She didn't need to address the masturbation accusations because they were irrelevant. The bicycle wasn't about sex, it was about power, about mobility, about autonomy, about women no longer being confined to homes and limited to places they could walk to or be escorted to by men. That's what really terrified Victorian society. Not that women might experience physical pleasure from bicycle saddles, but that women on bicycles were liberated. They could go where they wanted, when they wanted, without asking permission. They could travel alone. They could meet people without chaperones. They could explore the world under their own power. They could build strength and confidence and independence. And if society couldn't stop women from riding bicycles by warning about bicycle face or diseases or physical deformities, then maybe they could stop them by invoking the ultimate Victorian fear, female sexuality. By suggesting that women who rode bicycles were engaging in self-abuse, by pathologizing any pleasure women might experience, by making women so self-conscious and ashamed that they'd give up cycling rather than face accusations of sexual impropriety. It didn't work. Women kept riding, and the bicycle, despite all the moral panic, became one of the most important tools in the women's rights movement. It gave women mobility, independence, and yes, bloomers made a comeback because you couldn't ride a bicycle in floor-length skirts. The bicycle did more for dress reform than decades of previous attempts. The masturbation machine panic is a perfect example of how medical authority was weaponized against women's freedom. How fears about female sexuality were used to control women's behavior. How anything that gave women independence or pleasure or power had to be reframed as dangerous, immoral, and medically unsound. But it's also an example of how women persisted despite the panic, how they claimed the bicycle as their own, how they refused to be shamed or controlled, how they chose freedom and mobility over male approval and social acceptance. And in doing so, they paved the way for future generations of women to have even more autonomy, more choices, more control over their own bodies and lives. The bicycle wasn't a masturbation machine, it was a freedom machine, and that's exactly what made it so threatening. Now, you might think we've covered the full range of Victorian anxieties about female independence. Medical fears, fashion panics, warnings about mobility and sexuality, but we've been focusing mostly on individual women making individual choices. What happens when women start to organise collectively? When they start to demand legal and political rights as a group? When they form movements and hold conventions and publish manifestos? Because that's where Victorian panic really reached its peak. That's when the fear stopped being about individual women on bicycles or in bloomers and became about the entire social order potentially changing. And nowhere is this clearer than in the asylum records. In the documentation of women who were institutionalized not for illness, but for what was termed a tendency to cause trouble. Women who were locked away simply for being inconvenient, for asking too many questions, for wanting things they weren't supposed to want. And the stories of these women, they'll make you understand just how far society would go to maintain control. Take a breath, rest your mind, and prepare yourself for something that might be the most chilling part of our journey yet. Here's a question that might keep you up at night. What would it take for someone to have you committed to an insane asylum? Not today, of course. Today there are legal protections, due process, psychiatric evaluations by multiple professionals. But in the Victorian era, the bar was shockingly, terrifyingly low. Let me show you something. There's a document that still exists today from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia. It lists reasons why people were admitted between 1864 and 1889, and when I read you some of these reasons, I want you to remember that these are real. These are actual documented causes that resulted in people being locked away, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Laziness, egotism, disappointed love, female disease, mental excitement, greediness, imaginary female trouble, jealousy, religion, asthma, bad habits, novel reading, overaction of the mind, gathering in the head, domestic trouble, and then, perhaps most chilling of all, a tendency to cause trouble for others. A tendency to cause trouble. Think about what that could mean. Think about how broad that category is. Think about how many women throughout history have been accused of causing trouble simply by existing, simply by speaking, simply by wanting things they weren't supposed to want. Now, it's important to understand that this list represents supposed causes, the reasons physicians at the time believed had led to patients developing underlying mental illnesses like chronic dementia, acute mania, or melancholia. But here's the thing. When you look at who was being admitted and why, when you see the patterns in the data, it becomes clear that many of these admissions, particularly for women, had nothing to do with actual mental illness. They had everything to do with control. Women vastly outnumbered men in Victorian asylums, and the reasons women were committed reveal a systematic pattern of using psychiatric institutionalization as a tool to silence, punish, and dispose of inconvenient women. Women who stepped out of line, women who challenged authority, women who refused to accept their assigned roles, women who caused trouble. Let's talk about what could get a woman committed. We've already mentioned some of the more absurd items on the asylum list. But when we dig deeper into Victorian asylum records, the picture becomes even darker. A woman could be committed for asking for a divorce, just asking. Just saying out loud that she wanted to leave her marriage. That was enough evidence of insanity to have her locked away. She could be committed for rigorous intellectual study, for wanting to educate herself, for reading too much, for thinking too hard. Remember what we learned about Edward Clarke's warnings, the fear that women using their brains would damage their bodies. That fear didn't just stay theoretical, it resulted in women being institutionalized for the crime of intellectual curiosity. She could be committed for laziness, or for overworking, for being too emotional, or for being too cold, for having sexual desire, or for lacking it, for being religious, or for not being religious enough. The criteria were so broad, so contradictory, so subjective that almost any behavior could be pathologized if someone with authority decided it was abnormal. And here's the truly terrifying part. The process of commitment was remarkably easy, especially if the woman was married. A husband could have his wife committed with minimal paperwork. He needed a medical certificate from 1 or 2 doctors, depending on whether she was being admitted as a private patient or a pauper. That's it. No trial, no defense, no opportunity for the woman to tell her side of the story. And those doctors, they weren't required to conduct extensive examinations. They didn't need to demonstrate that the woman posed a danger to herself or others. They just needed to observe some behavior they considered abnormal. And what counted as abnormal for women was a remarkably low bar. Talking back to her husband, abnormal, refusing sexual relations, abnormal, wanting to manage her own money, abnormal, expressing political opinions, abnormal. One historian noted that the admission process was heavily weighted against women, that many women were admitted for very unsatisfactory reasons and basically forgotten about, that some spent 20 or more years locked away, that some died without ever being released. For what? For causing trouble, for being inconvenient, for failing to be the perfect, submissive, grateful, silent woman that society demanded. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in practice. Imagine a young woman, educated, intelligent, who reads novels and wants to discuss ideas. Her husband finds her exhausting. She asks too many questions. She has opinions about politics. She doesn't defer to him the way his mother deferred to his father. She's not content to sit quietly with her needlework while he reads the newspaper. She causes trouble. One day he calls in a doctor. The doctor asks the woman a few questions. Does she read novels? Yes. Does she sometimes feel anxious or have trouble sleeping? Yes, because she's living with someone who treats her like a child. Does she ever disagree with her husband? Yes, because he's often wrong. The doctor nods, makes notes, mental excitement, overaction of the mind, tendency to cause trouble. The diagnosis is clear: hysteria. Within days, she's taken to an asylum. She protests, of course, which only proves the diagnosis correct. A mentally sound woman would accept her husband's judgment. Her protestations are more evidence of her disturbed mental state. She's admitted, and once inside those walls, getting out becomes nearly impossible. Because here's how asylum confinement worked. The very act of protesting your sanity was taken as evidence of insanity. If you insisted you didn't belong there, that proved you lacked insight into your condition. If you became angry or upset about being locked away, that demonstrated emotional instability. If you cried, you were melancholic. If you didn't cry, you were unnaturally cold. If you tried to escape, you were dangerous. If you accepted your situation, you were chronically ill and required long-term care. It was a perfect trap. There was no way to behave that proved sanity. Every response to the trauma of being wrongfully imprisoned was reinterpreted as a symptom of mental illness. And for women especially, the standards were impossible. Any display of emotion was hysteria. Any lack of emotion was unnatural. Any assertion of autonomy was evidence of derangement. And the conditions inside these asylums, they were horrific. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was originally designed to house 250 patients. By 1880, it held 717. By 1938, 1,661. By 1950, at its peak, 2,600. In a building designed for 250. Can you imagine that level of overcrowding? There was barely space between the beds, no privacy, insufficient staff, poor sanitation, inadequate heating and lighting. Patients were treated like animals. Violent patients were chained to walls or locked in cages. Some were subjected to experimental treatments. cold water immersions, restraints, later, lobotomies. And remember, many of these patients weren't violent criminals or genuinely dangerous individuals. They were women who'd asked for divorces, women who'd read too many books, women who talked back, women who'd caused trouble. The hysteria diagnosis was particularly insidious because its symptoms were so broad as to be meaningless. Anxiety, shortness of breath, fainting, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, irritability, loss of appetite, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, and of course that most damning symptom of all, a tendency to cause trouble for others. Do you notice something about that list? Those are normal human experiences. Everyone feels anxious sometimes. Everyone has trouble sleeping occasionally. Everyone experiences irritability. But for women, these ordinary human feelings were pathologized. They were evidence of disease. They were grounds for institutionalization. And the treatments? They range from the paternalistic to the barbaric. Married women were told they needed more frequent intercourse with their husbands, as if being forced to have sex with the man who had you committed would cure anything. Unmarried women were subjected to pelvic massage by doctors, later vibrators, because the problem always was framed as sexual. The wandering womb, the retention of female seed, the lack of hysterical paroxysm. Other treatments included bed rest, bland food, avoidance of mental stimulation, essentially everything that would make a thinking person feel worse. You're anxious and upset about being locked away. Here, lie in bed doing nothing and eat gruel, that'll help. You're intellectually curious and frustrated by the lack of stimulation. Stop reading, stop thinking, that's what made you sick in the first place. Some doctors experimented with hypnosis, with electric shocks, with various forms of hydrotherapy, with isolation, with restraints, and later with lobotomies. Surgical destruction of parts of the brain to make patients more docile, more manageable, less trouble. The West Virginia lobotomy project in the early 1950s at the Trans-Allegheny Asylum was explicitly designed to reduce patient numbers by making people easier to control, not to cure them, not to help them, to control them, to make them less of a problem, to eliminate their tendency to cause trouble. Let that sink in. The solution to overcrowding wasn't better funding or more facilities or addressing the reasons people were being wrongfully committed. It was to surgically alter their brains so they'd be quieter, more compliant, less human. And who do you think was most likely to be lobotomized? Women. Women who were too emotional, too difficult, too resistant to authority. Women who caused trouble. This wasn't medicine. This was social control dressed up in medical language. This was patriarchy with a prescription pad. This was a systematic effort to eliminate any woman who didn't fit perfectly into the narrow, suffocating box that society had constructed for femininity. But here's what makes me angriest. This wasn't a secret. This wasn't a scandal that was later uncovered. This was openly discussed. Doctors published papers about it. Families knew what they were doing when they had their wives or daughters or sisters committed. Society understood that asylums were being used to dispose of inconvenient women, and no one stopped it. In fact, they justified it. They created elaborate medical theories to explain why certain behaviors in women indicated mental illness. They wrote textbooks about it. They trained new doctors in these methods. They built more and more asylums to house more and more women whose only crime was failing to be perfectly docile. And the women themselves? Many of them knew exactly what was happening. They knew they weren't insane. They knew they were being punished for being inconvenient. But what could they do? Every attempt to assert their sanity was taken as further evidence of illness. Every protest was another symptom. Every expression of anger or sadness or frustration was more proof that they belonged there. Some women tried to adapt, tried to be model patients, tried to demonstrate sanity through perfect obedience, but that rarely worked either, Because once you were labelled insane, everything you did was interpreted through that lens. Compliance wasn't evidence of sanity, it was evidence that the treatment was working, or evidence of chronic illness that required continued care. The records from these asylums are heartbreaking. Women writing letters that were never sent, begging to be released, insisting they were well, promising to be good wives, good daughters, good women if only they could go home, and their families, if they responded at all, told them to be patient, to accept the doctor's judgment, to understand that this was for their own good. For their own good. That phrase appears over and over in Victorian literature about women's health. Everything done to women was framed as being for their own good. The restrictions, the controls, the surgeries, the institutionalization, all of it was supposedly about protecting women from themselves. But it wasn't. It was about protecting men's power. It was about maintaining a social order that required women to be dependent, obedient, and silent. It was about having a mechanism to eliminate any woman who threatened that order. And the asylum system provided that mechanism perfectly. Because unlike divorce, which required legal proceedings and might result in scandal, commitment to an asylum was medical. It was private. It was framed as compassion. A husband wasn't punishing his wife for asking for a divorce. He was getting her the medical care she clearly needed, as evidenced by her irrational desire to leave a perfectly good marriage. A father wasn't silencing his daughter for wanting an education. He was protecting her from the mental strain that was causing her hysteria. It was the perfect crime, disguised as care, justified by medicine, protected by law, and incredibly difficult to prove or prosecute. Now you might be thinking, surely this couldn't have been that common. Surely most women weren't at risk of being institutionalized. But remember the numbers. Thousands and thousands of women in asylums, far more women than men. And remember those admission reasons: laziness, novel reading, asking for divorce, overaction of the mind, tendency to cause trouble. How many women could be described as lazy by husbands who expected them to manage households, raise children, and attend to their every need without complaint? How many women read novels? How many women experience domestic trouble? How many women cause trouble simply by having thoughts, feelings, and desires of their own? The threat was real, and women knew it, which meant that the asylum system functioned as a tool of control even for women who were never actually committed, because the possibility was always there. The threat hung over every argument, every disagreement, every assertion of autonomy. Behave, be quiet, don't cause trouble, or you might end up locked away. And that's the genius of it in a horrible way. You don't need to institutionalize every inconvenient woman. You just need to institutionalize enough of them that all women understand the consequences of stepping out of line. You just need the threat to be real enough that women police their own behavior, that they silence themselves before anyone else has to silence them. This is what systematic oppression looks like. Not just individual acts of cruelty, though there were plenty of those, but an entire system designed to maintain power imbalances. Legal mechanisms, medical theories, social expectations, all working together to keep women in their place, and all of it justified as being for women's own protection, for their own health, for their own good. The asylum system is perhaps the clearest example we've seen so far of how Victorian fears about female independence translated into actual mechanisms of control. It wasn't just rhetoric, it wasn't just social pressure. It was physical confinement. It was forcible treatment. It was the power to lock someone away for decades simply because they were inconvenient. And as horrifying as the asylum system was, it's just one piece of a larger picture. A picture of a society so threatened by female autonomy that it developed multiple overlapping systems of control: medical, legal, social, religious. All sending the same message: women who step out of line will be punished. But now we need to talk about perhaps the most direct threat to male power that Victorian women posed. Not just individual women being difficult or inconvenient, but women organising collectively, women demanding actual political rights, women wanting the vote. Because when women started asking for suffrage, when they started demanding a say in the laws that governed their lives, Victorian society's fears reached a fever pitch. And the arguments against women's suffrage? They reveal everything we've been discussing, distilled into its purest form. The belief that women's bodies made them unfit for political participation. The fear that giving women power would destroy civilization itself. And yes, medical theories about how voting would damage women's reproductive organs. Rest for a moment. Catch your breath. Because we're about to enter the final battleground of Victorian resistance to female independence. If you thought Victorian society had exhausted its catalogue of fears about female independence, you haven't seen anything yet. Because when women started organising not just for education or mobility or property rights, but for actual political power, for the right to vote, for a say in the laws that govern their lives, that's when Victorian anxiety transformed into full-scale panic. And the person leading that panic, the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria herself. In 1870, when Queen Victoria learned that Viscountess Amberley had become president of the Bristol and West of England Women's Suffrage Society, she wrote a private letter that perfectly captures the hysteria, and I'm using that word deliberately, surrounding women's political participation. She wrote, "I am most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this wicked folly of women's rights, with all its attendant horrors, on which her poor feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feeling and propriety. Lady Amberley ought to get a good whipping. Were women to unsex themselves by claiming equality with men, they would become the most hateful, heathen and disgusting of beings and would surely perish without male protection." Let me repeat a few key phrases from that. Mad, wicked folly, attendant horrors, poor feeble sex, unsex themselves, most hateful, heathen and disgusting of beings, perish without male protection. This is Queen Victoria, a woman who literally ruled an empire, a woman who made political decisions that affected millions of people, a woman who commanded armies, appointed prime ministers, and shaped international policy. And she believed that other women wanting the right to vote would unsex them and turn them into hateful, heathen, disgusting beings. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking, but it's also revealing, because Victoria saw herself as an exception. She was queen by divine right, by birth, by the grace of God. That was different from common women choosing their leaders through voting. That would be chaos. That would upset the natural order. That would, in her words, be a mad, wicked folly. But Victoria wasn't alone in her opposition. The arguments against women's suffrage came from all directions, from politicians, from religious leaders, from medical professionals, and yes, from other women. Women who believed that seeking the vote was unnatural, unwomanly, and dangerous. Let's start with the supposedly biological arguments, because by now we know that Victorian society loved using biology to justify inequality. The most common argument was that men and women were fundamentally different, that this difference extended beyond physical bodies to mental capacities, emotional temperaments and social roles, and that these differences made women inherently unsuited for political participation. Some argued that women lacked the mental capacity to understand political issues, that their brains were smaller, their intellects weaker, their powers of reasoning inferior. Never mind that these same people had no problem with uneducated men voting. Never mind that intelligence tests weren't required for male suffrage. The argument was specifically about women's inherent cognitive limitations. Others focused on women's emotional nature. Women were too emotional, they said, to make rational political decisions. They would vote based on feelings rather than facts. They would be swayed by appearances rather than arguments. They would let their hearts rather than their heads guide their choices. Again, no one seemed concerned about emotional men voting. Only emotional women more emotional women were a problem. Then there were the arguments about women's sphere. Politics, they said, was the public realm. It was dirty, corrupt, competitive, aggressive, everything that was antithetical to feminine virtue. Women belonged in the private sphere, in the home, where they could be pure, moral, nurturing, gentle. If women entered politics, they would become coarsened, hardened, masculinized. They would lose their essential femininity. They would, to use Queen Victoria's phrase, unsex themselves. And what would happen to the home if the women got involved in politics? Who would care for the children? Who would maintain the moral centre of family life? One anti-suffrage pamphlet distributed by the National Association Opposed to Woman Suffrage actually argued that women didn't need to vote because you do not need a ballot to clean out your sink. Another pamphlet, titled Household Hints, mixed anti-suffrage propaganda with useful household advice like sour milk removes ink spots, encouraging women not to waste time, energy and money by voting. The message was clear. Women's proper work was domestic. Voting would distract from that work. It would take time and energy away from the home. It would confuse women's priorities. And ultimately it would destroy the family unit, which was seen as the foundation of civilization itself. Some anti-suffragists argued that most women didn't even want the vote, that only a few radical, troublesome women were agitating for it, that the vast majority of women were content with their roles and didn't want the burden of political responsibility. This despite the fact that suffrage movements were collecting hundreds of thousands of signatures on petitions. Despite the fact that women were organising across the country, holding meetings, giving speeches, publishing newspapers, apparently all those women didn't count as most women. Others claimed that women's votes would simply duplicate their husbands' votes, that women would just vote the way their husbands told them to vote. So granting women suffrage would be pointless. It would double the electorate without adding any new perspectives. It would cost more money to run elections without providing any benefit, which raises an obvious question. If women would just vote like their husbands anyway, why were men so terrified of women getting the vote? The answer, of course, is that men didn't actually believe women would vote like their husbands. They were afraid women would vote differently, that women would support different policies, that women would push for reforms that men opposed. Specifically, many industrialists, distillers, and brewers feared that women voters would support prohibition of alcohol, that women would act out of these with their natural maternal instinct to protect families from the evils of drink. In other words, men were afraid that women would use political power to advance their own interests and values, which is exactly what voting is supposed to be about. But when it came to women, this was framed as a danger rather than a right. There was also a racial dimension to anti-suffrage arguments, particularly in the American South. Some opponents feared that granting suffrage to all women would mean granting it to black women and immigrant women. They couldn't give the vote only to certain women deemed worthy. It would have to be universal, and that prospect terrified white supremacists who were already working hard to disenfranchise black men. Religious arguments were mobilized as well. Women are by nature and also according to God and the Bible meant to be subordinated to men, opponents argued. The Bible commanded wives to submit to their husbands. Women's political activism was rebellion against divine order. It was sinful. It was Eve's prideful desire for knowledge all over again. But perhaps the most insidious arguments were the ones framed as being for women's own protection. Politics is dirty, they said. It's corrupt and ugly. Women shouldn't sully themselves with such things. They're too pure, too good, too refined. They need to stay above the fray. One anti-suffrage argument claimed that voting would require women to serve on juries, and jury service is abhorrent to every normal woman. Women would be compelled to hear all the repugnant details incident to murder trials and trials for other crimes, disclosing unspeakable wickedness. Notice the language, normal women. The implication being that any woman who wanted to vote, who wanted to serve on juries, who wanted to participate in civic life was abnormal, unnatural, not a real woman. This connects directly to everything we've discussed. The wandering womb theory said women's bodies made them irrational. Bicycle face said mobility would masculinize women. Novel reading would overstimulate their imaginations. University education would damage their reproductive organs. Bloomers would make the coarse. Bicycle saddles would corrupt them sexually, and any woman who stepped too far out of line could be institutionalized for having a tendency to cause trouble. All of these fears culminated in the suffrage debate. Because voting represented real power, legal power, political power, the power to change laws, to elect representatives, to participate in governance, and Victorian society would not accept that women should have that power. One anti-suffrage argument stated plainly, the men are able to run the government and take care of the women. Do women have to vote in order to receive the protection of man? Why, men have gone to war, endured every privation and death itself in defense of woman. To man, woman is the dearest creature on earth, and there is no extreme to which he would not go for his mother or sister. By keeping woman in her exalted position, man can be induced to do more for her than he could by having her mix up in affairs that will cause him to lose respect and regard for her. Read that carefully. It's saying that men will do more for women if women stay in their exalted position, meaning their subordinate position, meaning powerless. That men will lose respect for women if women get involved in politics. That women have more influence by not having any actual power. That the best way for women to get what they need is to remain dependent on male protection and claiming their own rights. It's protection racket logic. We'll take care of you as long as you do what we say. As long as you stay in your place, as long as you don't challenge our authority. The moment you try to claim your own power, we'll lose respect for you, and then who will protect you? But women didn't want protection. They wanted rights. They wanted the same legal status that men had. They wanted to participate in decisions that affected their lives. They wanted, in short, to be full citizens rather than perpetual children under male guardianship. And so they organized. Despite all the opposition, despite the mockery and the threats, despite it being told they were mad, wicked, unnatural, disgusting, despite Queen Victoria herself calling them a poor feeble sex bent on folly, the suffrage movement had been active since at least the 1820s. In 1825, William Thompson and Anna Wheeler wrote an appeal of one half the human race, women, against the pretensions of the other half, men, to retain them in political, and thence in civil and domestic slavery. The title alone is magnificent. It lays bare exactly what was happening. One half of the human race attempting to keep the other half in slavery. By the 1870s and 1880s, the movement was gaining momentum. Meetings were held all over Britain. Speakers like Millicent Fawcett addressed crowds. Petitions gathered an average of 200,000 signatures a year. The subject was debated in the House of Commons every single year from 1870 to 1879, and from 1886 onwards, every vote taken showed that the majority of members of Parliament favoured women's suffrage. Let me repeat that. The majority of MPs favoured women's suffrage, and yet it still wasn't permitted to become law. Why? Because the men in power, despite their stated support, kept finding reasons to delay, to defer, to table the discussion, to prioritise other issues. This is a pattern we have seen throughout our journey. Society acknowledging that the restrictions on women were unjust while simultaneously doing everything possible to maintain those restrictions, admitting that women weren't actually mentally inferior while still refusing them university education, conceding that coverture was harsh while opposing property rights reforms, knowing that asylum admissions were being abused while continuing to institutionalize inconvenient women. With suffrage, this pattern reached its ultimate expression. MPs voted in favour of women's suffrage in principle, but not in practice, not yet, not this year, not this session, always later, always tomorrow, always some excuse for why now wasn't the right time. And so women kept pushing. Some, like Millicent Fawcett's National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, believed in peaceful, lawful protest, petitions, public meetings, lobbying, patient persuasion. They argued that if women caused trouble, it would confirm men's beliefs that women couldn't be trusted. But by 1903, other women had lost patience with this approach. Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, and their tactics were very different. They were militant, confrontational. They interrupted political meetings. They chained themselves to railings. They went on hunger strikes in prison. They broke windows. They set fires. They became, in short, what Victorian society had always feared: troublesome women. Women who refused to wait patiently for men to grant them rights. Women who demanded what was theirs, and society responded exactly as you'd expect. The suffragettes, as they came to be known, were vilified, arrested, force-fed when they went on hunger strikes, brutalized by police, called hysterical, called unfeminine, called everything that Victorian society had been calling rebellious women for decades. But here's the thing, the militant tactics worked, not because they convinced men that women deserved the vote, but because they made it clear that women wouldn't stop fighting until they got it, that the social order couldn't be maintained by simply saying no, that women had reached a breaking point. World War I changed things too. When men went to war, women took over their jobs. They worked in factories, they drove ambulances, they served as nurses at the front. They proved they could do everything men had always said they couldn't do. And when the war ended, it became impossible to justify denying the vote to women who had just helped win it. In 1918, Britain granted suffrage to women over 30 who met certain property qualifications. Not universal suffrage, not equality, but a beginning. It would take another 10 years until 1928 for British women to get the same voting rights as men. In the United States, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, though it would be decades before all women, particularly women of colour, could actually exercise that right without facing violence and intimidation. So what do we learn from the suffrage battle? We learn that Victorian fears about female independence were never really about biology or divine will or natural order. They were about power, about who had it and who didn't, about who made decisions and who had to live with decisions made for them, about who was a full citizen and who was, in the words of Thompson and Wheeler, kept in political, civil and domestic slavery. Every argument against suffrage was an argument for maintaining that inequality. Every claim that women were too emotional, too pure, too domestic, too protected was really saying, women should not have power equal to men. Women should not participate in governance. Women should not have a voice in their own futures. And every medical theory we've discussed, from wandering wombs to bicycle face to novel reading dangers to education damaged ovaries to masturbation teaching saddles to hysteria diagnoses leading to asylum commitment, every single one was part of this same project. The project of justifying women's exclusion from power by claiming it was for their own good, for their own health, for their own protection. But women saw through it. Women understood that these weren't proactions, they were chains, gilded perhaps, justified with medical language and religious authority, but chains nonetheless. And they broke those chains. Not easily, not quickly, not without tremendous personal cost, but they broke them. Women fought for the vote for generations. They endured mockery, arrest, force-feeding, social ostracism. They risked their reputations, their safety, their lives. Because they understood what was at stake, not just the right to mark a ballot, but the recognition that they were full human beings, that they deserved the same legal status, the same political voice, the same basic rights as men. The suffrage victory wasn't the end of the struggle, but it was a crucial turning point. It was the moment when women proved definitively that Victorian fears about female independence were baseless, that women could participate in politics without civilization collapsing, that giving women power didn't destroy society. In fact, it improved it. Because that's what all of Victorian society's fears had in common, isn't it? The prediction that if women had independence, mobility, education, property rights, political power, everything would fall apart. The family would disintegrate, morality would collapse, civilization would end, and none of it came true. Women got the vote and the world kept turning. Women went to universities and their ovaries didn't shrivel. Women wore comfortable clothing and they didn't become masculine monsters. Women rode bicycles and they didn't turn into sexually depraved maniacs. Women read novels and they didn't go insane. Women owned property and marriage didn't disappear. What did disappear, slowly and incompletely, was the systematic subjugation of women, the legal erasure, the medical control, the social policing, not completely. We're still fighting many of these battles today, but the Victorian edifice of female subordination cracked when women got the vote, because political power meant the ability to change other laws, to push for further reforms, to have a say in their own lives. And that's why suffrage mattered so much. That's why the opposition was so fierce, because once women had political power, everything else became possible. But now, as we near the end of our journey through Victorian fears, we need to ask ourselves a bigger question. Who were these Victorian women who fought against all of this? What drove them to persist despite the odds? What did it mean to be a new woman in the late Victorian era? Because there was a term for women who challenged the old order, women who demanded education and careers and independence, women who refused to be defined solely by marriage and motherhood. They were called new women, and they represented everything Victorian society both feared and grudgingly had to acknowledge was coming. They were the future, and the old world knew it was losing. Take a moment, let the weight of this resistance settle, and then let's meet these remarkable women who refused to stay in their place. She smoked cigarettes, she rode a bicycle, she wore trousers, she lived alone with a latchkey, she read books, she had opinions about politics. She might not want to marry. She definitely didn't want to be defined solely as someone's wife or mother. She was educated, independent, self-supporting. She was choosing her own life rather than accepting the one society assigned to her. She was the new woman. And in the 1890s, she represented everything Victorian society had been trying to prevent for decades. The term itself was coined in 1894 by British writer Sarah Grand in an essay titled The New Aspect of the Woman Question. Grand used it to describe women who exercised control over their own lives, be it personal, social, or economic. Women who proclaimed for themselves what was wrong with the idea that home was woman's sphere, and who prescribed the remedy. Women who had been, as Grand put it, in silent contemplation for generations and were now ready to speak. The name caught on immediately. Within months, New Woman became shorthand throughout Britain and America for a specific type of young, educated, independent woman. A woman who was challenging everything the Victorian era held sacred about femininity. And the reaction, it was exactly what you'd expect. A mixture of fascination, horror, mockery, and panic. But here's what makes the New Woman different from all the individual fears we've discussed so far. She wasn't just doing one threatening thing. She was embodying a complete alternative to Victorian womanhood. She was living proof that women could exist outside the narrow confines of daughter, wife, mother. that women could be whole people with their own ambitions, desires, and purposes, that women didn't need men to define them or protect them or complete them, and that terrified people. Because if the new woman could exist, if she could thrive, if she could be happy and successful and fulfilled without following the traditional path, then what did that say about all the restrictions, all the fears, all the medical warnings, all the social pressures that have been used for generations to keep women in their place? Let's talk about who the new woman actually was. First, she was educated. By the 1890s, women's colleges had been established at Oxford and Cambridge. The University of London had been granting degrees to women since 1878. Women could study, they could pursue knowledge, they could develop their intellects without their ovaries falling out, despite what Edward Clarke had warned. Second, she was economically independent. The pink-collar workforce had emerged, giving women a foothold in business and institutional spheres. Women were working as teachers, nurses, secretaries, typists. Some were even entering professions like medicine, law, and journalism. They were earning their own money. They didn't need to marry for financial security. Third, she had control over her own movements. Thanks to the bicycle, thanks to changes in transportation, thanks to the gradual relaxation of chaperoning rules, women could go where they wanted. They could travel alone. They had latchkeys to their own apartments or lodgings. They could meet friends without permission. They could explore the city without male escorts. Fourth, and perhaps most threatening, she had her own ideas about sexuality and relationships. The new woman wasn't necessarily opposed to marriage, but she believed in marriage for love, not economic necessity. She believed in mutual respect between partners. She believed in the right to refuse marriage if she preferred independence. And she believed radically that women's sexuality existed independently of reproduction, that women had desires and feelings that mattered. This last point was especially controversial. New woman writers like George Egerton wrote about female sexuality with shocking frankness. They explored women's inner lives, their actual feelings and desires, rather than the sanitized version that men imagined. As Egerton put it, there was only one small plot left for woman to tell, the terra incognita of herself as she knew herself to be, not as man liked to imagine her. In a word, to give herself away as man had given himself away in his writings, and they did give themselves away. Writers like Sarah Gran, George Egerton, Olive Schreiner, Ella Darcy published stories and novellas that explored women's real experiences. Sarah Gran's The Heavenly Twins, published in 1894, told the story of a woman who refused to consummate her marriage when she discovered her husband had a dubious sexual past. It was a direct attack on the double standard that expected sexual purity from wives but not from husbands. George Egerton's short story collections, Keynotes and Discords, published in 1893 and 1894, were cultural sensations. They treated women's sexuality with a frankness that shocked contemporaries. They were published in the Yellow Book, an avant-garde magazine associated with the aesthetic movement, alongside work by the male writers like Oscar Wilde. And this is important. The new woman wasn't operating in isolation. She was part of a broader cultural revolution happening at the fin de siècle, the end of the century. Art, politics, science, society were all being revolutionized. New theories, new challenges to tradition, new ways of thinking about everything. The new woman was part of that upheaval. She was contemporary with new socialism, new imperialism, new fiction, new journalism. She was one manifestation of a culture that was questioning and reimagining itself. But while the decadent dandies like Oscar Wilde were celebrated, at least initially, as artistic geniuses, the new woman was more often mocked and vilified. Punch magazine, the satirical publication, ran countless cartoons depicting new women as ugly, mannish, ridiculous figures. They drew her with cigarettes dangling from her lips, wearing men's clothes, abandoning crying babies, terrifying decent men. The message was clear. The new woman was unnatural, unfeminine, disgusting. One writer described the new woman as the Victorians saw her, the unsexed, terrifying, violent Amazon, ready to overturn the world. A comic fictional figure composed of punch cartoons, much vilified novels, and ominous warnings in popular articles. A grotesque buffoon. Notice that language. Unsexed, terrifying, violent, grotesque. The same language that had been used about women who wanted education, who rode bicycles, who wore bloomers, who asked for divorces. The same fear that women claiming autonomy were somehow losing their essential femininity. But the reality was very different from the caricature. Real new women weren't violent Amazons. They were teachers and doctors and writers and activists. They were women who wanted to use their educations, who wanted meaningful work, who wanted to participate in public life, who wanted to be treated as full human beings rather than decorative objects or domestic servants. Sarah Grand herself is a perfect example. Born Frances McFall in 1854, she married a British military surgeon and spent years living abroad as an army wife. She wrote her first novel, Ideala, in 1888, about a woman struggling with wanting to leave her unfaithful husband. The novel helped Grand summon the courage to leave her own husband in 1890 and relocate to London. She renamed herself Sarah Grand with the publication of her work, choosing a feminine pseudonym instead of a male one, which reflected her political views and her drive toward women's emancipation. She was also a lifelong activist. She'd been expelled from school in 1868 for protesting against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed for the forcible detainment of prostitutes while the men who frequented them remained free to spread disease. Throughout her life, she fought for women's sexual autonomy, for education, for public health, for the recognition that women's moral standards should apply to men as well. Other new women had different focuses. Olive Schreiner wrote about sexual freedom and challenged racial hierarchies in her novel The Story of an African Farm. Some new women were suffragettes, some were socialists or communists, some focused on labour rights or free love movements. The new woman wasn't a monolithic figure. She was diverse. She represented different paths forward, different visions of what female independence could look like. But all new women shared certain characteristics. Self-determination, the refusal to be defined solely by relationships to men, the belief that women deserve the same opportunities as men, and the courage to live according to those beliefs despite intense social pressure to conform. And make no mistake, the pressure was intense. New women were ridiculed in the press, mocked in cartoons, criticized from pulpits, warned about by doctors. One Victorian commentator declared that the new woman was a figment of the journalistic imagination, a grotesque creation designed to frighten people away from any real progress in women's rights. There's truth to that. The caricature of the new woman, the cigarette-smoking, mannish, baby-abandoning monster, was designed to make real women's liberation seem absurd and threatening. It was a way of saying you don't want to be like those new women, do you? You want to be normal, feminine, respectable. You want to stay in your place. But thousands of women didn't stay in their place. They became teachers even though people said women couldn't handle authority. They became doctors even though people said medicine was too brutal for feminine sensibilities. They became writers even though people said women had nothing important to say. They lived independently even though people said women needed male protection. They remained unmarried even though people said spinsters were failures and tragedies. And do you know what happened? They were fine. Better than fine, they were fulfilled. They proved that all the Victorian fears were baseless. That women's bodies didn't fail them when they used their minds. That women didn't become masculine when they exercised independence. That women didn't need marriage to be happy or successful or complete. But acknowledging this would have required admitting that generations of restrictions had been wrong. that all the medical theories, all the religious justifications, all the social expectations had been tools of oppression rather than protection, that women had been denied opportunities and autonomy for no good reason beyond maintaining male power. And Victorian society wasn't ready to admit that. So instead, they doubled down on the mockery. They called new women selfish for prioritizing their own development. They called them unnatural for not wanting traditional domestic lives. They said they were destroying the family, corrupting morals, leading society to ruin. The same arguments that had been used against every form of female independence. And there's another dimension we need to acknowledge. The new woman, as a cultural phenomenon, was primarily middle and upper class. Working class women had been working outside the home for generations. They'd never had the luxury of the separate spheres ideology. Poor women, immigrant women, women of colour weren't part of the new woman conversation in the same way. They faced different barriers, different struggles, different forms of oppression. Some new woman writers recognised this. They critiqued how the movement's focus on middle-class concerns ignored the realities of women who couldn't afford higher education, who needed to work to survive rather than for self-fulfillment. Others didn't. They imagined liberation in ways that were only accessible to privileged women. This created tensions within feminism that persist today. But even with those limitations, the new woman represented something revolutionary. She represented the idea that womanhood could be more than one narrow path, that women could define themselves, that female independence wasn't a threat to civilization but a step toward justice. The new woman era reached its peak in the mid-1890s. By the end of the decade, particularly after Oscar Wilde's trial and imprisonment in 1895, there was a backlash against everything associated with decadence and aesthetic rebellion. Punch magazine gleefully announced the end of the new woman. The crash has come at last. New woman fiction declined markedly after 1895, but the new woman herself didn't disappear. She evolved. She became the suffragette of the early 1900s, the working woman of World War I, the flapper of the 1920s. She kept changing, adapting, pushing boundaries, because once women had tasted independence, once they'd experienced what it felt like to make their own choices and control their own lives, there was no going back. And that's the real legacy of the new woman. Not the specific fashions or the specific arguments or the specific books, but the fundamental challenge she posed to Victorian assumptions about women's nature and women's place. She proved that all the fears were wrong, that women could handle education, employment, independence, sexuality, political participation, that women were fully human and deserved to be treated as such. Every woman who goes to university today stands on the shoulders of new women who fought for educational access. Every woman who works in a profession stands on the shoulders of new women who broke into male-dominated fields. Every woman who lives alone, who controls her own money, who makes her own choices about marriage and children, who defines her own identity beyond relationships to men, is living the reality that the new woman fought to make possible. Victorian fears about female independence weren't really about protecting women. They were about controlling women, about maintaining a social order that benefited men at women's expense, about keeping power concentrated in male hands. The new woman exposed that. She showed that when women were free to be themselves, civilization didn't collapse, it improved. Because half the population finally had the chance to contribute fully to society. And now, as we near the end of our journey through Victorian anxieties, there's one more concept we need to explore. Because underpinning all of these fears, from wandering wombs to voting rights, was a grand theory about why women needed to be restricted. It was called the ideology of separate spheres, the idea that men and women belonged in different realms of existence with different purposes, different capabilities, different destinies. Men in the public sphere of work and politics, women in the private sphere of home and family. And never should these spheres intersect. This ideology justified everything we've discussed. And understanding it is key to understanding why Victorian society resisted female independence so fiercely. Because once you see how separate spheres worked, you see the architecture of oppression laid bare. Let the weight of what the new woman achieved settle in your mind. And then let's examine the grand theory that she destroyed simply by existing. Imagine a world divided into two realms. In one realm there is ambition, intellect, commerce, politics, law, science, art, and progress. In the other realm there is purity, morality, domesticity, nurturing, self-sacrifice, and submission. Men inhabit the first realm, women inhabit the second. And never ever should these realms intersect. This was the ideology of separate spheres, and it was the foundation upon which every fear we've discussed was built. The doctrine of separate spheres wasn't just a social custom. It was presented as natural law, as divine will, as biological necessity. The public sphere, the realm of work and politics and ambition, was masculine by nature. The private sphere, the realm of home and family and care, was feminine by nature. And attempting to cross between these spheres was not just improper, it was unnatural, it was dangerous, it would destroy both the individual and society itself. This ideology reached its most articulated forms in 1854 with the publication of a poem by Coventry Patmore called The Angel in the House. Patmore based it on his own wife Emily, whom he considered the perfect woman, and in his poem he created the definitive image of Victorian femininity, the angel, the ideal wife, the domestic goddess. Let me describe her for you. She was intensely sympathetic, immensely charming, utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed daily. If there was a chicken, she took the leg. If there was a draught, she sat in it. Above all, she was pure. She had no sexual desires, no ambitions beyond pleasing her husband, no thoughts of her own that might conflict with his. She was, as one critic wrote, enduringly, incorruptibly good, instinctively, infallibly wise. Wise not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. Wise not that she may set herself above her husband, but that she may never fail from his side. Read that phrase again. Self-renunciation. She was supposed to be wise in how to eliminate herself, how to have no self at all beyond her relationship to her husband. The poem was largely ignored when it was first published, but by the late 19th century it had become enormously popular in both America and Britain. It was taught in schools, referenced in sermons, held up as the model that all women should aspire to. The angel in the house became the definitive image of what a proper woman should be. And what happened if a woman wasn't an angel? Well, then she must be something else, something fallen, something impure. Because in the Victorian imagination there were only two types of women, angels and fallen women, Madonna and whore. There was no middle ground, no space for women who were simply human, with both virtues and flaws, strengths and weaknesses, desires and boundaries. The ideology of separate spheres was closely tied to economic changes. In earlier centuries, it had been normal for women to work alongside their husbands and brothers in family businesses. Living over the shop made it easy for women to help with serving customers or keeping accounts, while also managing domestic duties. But as the 19th century progressed and industrialization accelerated, men increasingly commuted to factories, shops, or offices. The workplace and the home became physically separated. And with that physical separation came an ideological one. Wives, daughters, and sisters were left at home all day to oversee domestic duties, increasingly carried out by servants in middle and upper-class households. And from the 1830s onward, women started adopting the crinoline, those huge bell-shaped skirts that made it virtually impossible to clean a grate or sweep stairs without tumbling over. The clothing itself reinforced the separation. Women's fashion became so impractical that it announced to the world, this woman does not work. This woman is decorative. This woman exists to be looked at, not to do. The two sexes now inhabited what Victorians called separate spheres, only coming together at breakfast and dinner, and this separation was justified by supposedly natural characteristics of men and women. Men were rational, objective, competitive, ambitious, strong. Women were emotional, subjective, nurturing, submissive, weak. Men were active, creating and destroying in the public world. Women were passive, preserving and maintaining in the private world. Men were made for the harsh realities of commerce and politics. Women were made for the gentle sanctuary of home. The Victorian writer John Ruskin articulated this clearly in his lecture of Queen's Gardens in 1865. He wrote that the home was a sacred place, a vestal temple, a temple of the hearth watched over by household gods. And those household gods were women. Women who created a place of peace where men could take refuge from the difficulties of modern life. The home in Ruskin's vision was pure because women were pure. It was moral because women were moral. It was a sanctuary because women made it so. But here's what this meant in practice. Women were expected to maintain this purity, this morality, this sanctuary, by staying inside it. If a woman ventured into the public sphere, into the dirty world of business and politics, she would become contaminated. She would lose her purity. She would no longer be able to fulfill her sacred duty of moral guardianship. And if women failed at this duty, if the home ceased to be a sanctuary, then men would have nowhere to retreat. Civilization itself would crumble. Do you see how this works? Women's confinement to the home wasn't presented as oppression. It was presented as women's special power, their sacred duty, their noble purpose. Women weren't being restricted. They were being elevated. They weren't being controlled. They were being protected. They weren't being denied opportunities. They were being given the highest calling of all, maintaining the moral foundation of society. It's brilliant, in a horrifying way, because how do you rebel against being told you're sacred? How do you reject being placed on a pedestal, especially when that pedestal is the only place society says you're allowed to stand? And this ideology explains everything we've discussed. Every fear, every restriction, every medical theory, every social pressure. They all flow from the fundamental premise that women and men occupy different spheres and must not cross into each other's territory. Women getting university education, that's crossing into the masculine sphere of intellectual development. It will damage their feminine nature. Women riding bicycles, that's crossing into the masculine sphere of independent mobility. It will masculinize them. Women wearing bloomers, that's adopting masculine clothing. It will unsex them. Women reading novels, that's filling their minds with ideas beyond the domestic sphere. It will overstimulate them and make them unfit for their duties. Women owning property, that's participating in economic power which belongs to the public masculine sphere. Women voting, that's participating in political power, the ultimate masculine domain. Women working in professions, that's leaving the private sphere for the public one. Women living independently as new women, that's rejecting the entire system of separate spheres. Every single thing that women wanted to do, every form of independence they sought, was framed as a violation of natural law. Because according to separate spheres ideology, women wanting anything beyond domesticity was as unnatural as water flowing uphill. It went against their essential nature. But whose nature? Let's talk about who this ideology actually served. Because it certainly wasn't working for most women. Conduct books like Sarah Stickney Ellis's The Daughters of England, published in the 1840s, explicitly stated that women must be content to be inferior to men, that they must focus entirely on creating a virtuous home and offering moral influence, that any ambition beyond that was wrong, and many women tried to live up to this ideal. They tried to be angels, they tried to find complete fulfillment in domesticity. And you know what happened? They got sick, chronically, mysteriously sick. Crushing headaches, sleeplessness, constant noises in their ears, nervous exhaustion, depression. It was not uncommon for women to become ill because their temperaments did not fit the sphere to which they were confined. When you tell intelligent, capable women that they must suppress every ambition, every thought, every desire that doesn't relate to serving their husbands and raising their children, when you tell them this is their natural purpose and any unhappiness with it means there's something wrong with them, you create illness. You create the very hysteria that doctors then diagnosed as a female disease, Charlotte Perkins Gilmanstry. The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, is the most famous fictional account of this. A woman prescribed rest cure for her nervous condition is forbidden from working or writing. She's confined to a room to rest, and slowly she goes mad. The story was based on Gilman's own experience, and it illustrated perfectly how the supposed cure confined us. Confinement to the private sphere was actually the cause of the illness. But while middle and upper-class women were being told their natural place was at home, working-class women had no such luxury. Poor women worked. They had always worked. They worked in factories, as domestic servants, as washerwomen, as street vendors. The ideology of separate spheres didn't apply to them, or rather it applied to them as an aspiration that was forever out of reach. Working-class women were failing at being proper women simply by needing to work to survive. This created a hierarchy of feminine. Upper-class women who could afford to stay home and be angels were the most feminine, the most respectable. Middle-class women who had to work were less feminine. Working-class women who did manual labour were barely considered women at all. And women of colour, immigrant women, they weren't even included in the conversation about proper femininity. The angel in the house was white, wealthy and Christian. Anyone else was already fallen. So the ideology of separate spheres wasn't just about controlling all women, it was about creating a specific ideal of womanhood that only a privileged few could attain, and then using that ideal to judge all women. Women who didn't live up to it, whether by choice or circumstance, were failures, deviants, problems to be solved. And here's the final layer of this. While women were being told that the private sphere was their natural domain, they had no actual power within that domain. Because remember coverture, remember how married women legally cease to exist? A woman might be queen of her home, but her husband was the king of that kingdom. He owned the house, he controlled the money, he had legal authority over the children, he could make all the major decisions. The woman's power was purely moral and emotional. She could influence through gentleness and virtue, but she couldn't command, she couldn't decide, she couldn't act independently. So women were told you are naturally suited for the private sphere. This is your realm. This is where you have power. But actually you have no real power here either. You can only operate through male authority. You can only act with male permission. Your influence is real only to the extent that men allow it to be. It's a perfect trap. Women are restricted to a sphere where they're told they have special power. But that power is entirely dependent on male approval. And if they try to gain actual power that doesn't require male permission, they're told they're violating their nature. They're trying to be men. They're destroying civilization. This is why Victorian society fought so hard against every form of female independence, because female independence exposed the lie at the heart of separate spheres ideology, the lie that this arrangement was natural, divinely ordained, and beneficial to women. If women could be happy and successful outside the private sphere, if they could exercise real power in the public sphere, if they could thrive without being confined to domesticity, then the whole system was revealed as what it actually was, not protection, not elevation, but a mechanism of control designed to keep power in male hands. And women did expose that lie. Women like the ones we've discussed throughout this journey, women who pursued education despite warnings about damaged ovaries, women who rode bicycles despite fears of bicycle face and masturbation, women who read novels despite concerns about mental stimulation, women who fought for property rights despite the sacred ideal of marital unity, women who demanded the vote despite being told they'd unsex themselves, women who became new women despite mockery and condemnation. Every woman who refused to stay in her assigned sphere proved that the ideology was false, that women could handle education, exercise, intellectual work, economic independence, political participation, that women were fully human, that the separate spheres were not natural law but social construction, that they could be challenged, resisted, and ultimately destroyed. And by the end of the Victorian era, the ideology was crumbling, not because men suddenly became enlightened, but because enough women had pushed hard enough, fought long enough, and refused to accept the limitations. They had proven through their own lives that the angel in the house was not the only way to be a woman, that domesticity was not every woman's natural calling, that the private sphere was not women's inevitable destiny. The writer Virginia Woolf, looking back at the Victorian era, wrote about killing the angel in the house. She said, "I turned upon her and caught her by the throat. I did my best to kill her. My excuse if I were to be had up in a court of law would be that I acted in self-defense. Had I not killed her, she would have killed me. She would have plucked the heart out of my writing." That's what the angel represented. Death of the self, death of ambition, death of voice, and killing her was necessary for women to live as full human beings. We're not Victorian. We don't live in a world where women are legally erased upon marriage, or where female university students are medical curiosities. But the ideology of separate spheres didn't die completely. Its echoes remain in the wage gap, in the assumption that women will do most of the domestic labour even when they work full-time, in the career penalties women face for having children while men receive a fatherhood bonus, in the way women in politics or business are still judged by different standards than men, in the lingering belief that women are naturally better at nurturing and men are naturally better at leading. The architecture of oppression that Victorian society built so carefully, justified so elaborately, and defended so fiercely hasn't been completely dismantled. We've removed many of the most obvious structural supports, but the foundation remains. And understanding that foundation, understanding how separate spheres ideology worked, and why it was so effective, helps us see the ways those same patterns continue today. And now, as we reach the final part of our journey, we need to ask one last question. What do these Victorian fears teach us? What lessons can we draw from this history? What does it mean to look back at a society that was so certain it was right, so convinced that restricting women was natural and necessary and good, and to see how catastrophically wrong they were? Because the Victorian era has something important to tell us about our own time, about the ways we justify inequality, about the difference between protection and control, about the courage it takes to challenge what everyone says is natural and inevitable, and about how progress happens not because society becomes enlightened, but because people refuse to accept oppression, even when that oppression is dressed up as care. Take a final breath, rest your mind, and let's bring this all together. So here we are, at the end of our journey through Victorian anxieties about female independence. We've travelled from wandering wombs to voting rights, from bicycle saddles to asylum admissions, from bloomers to the new woman, from individual fears to the grand ideology that justified them all. And now it's time to ask, what does all of this mean? What can we learn from looking back at a society that was so certain women needed to be controlled for their own good? The first lesson is the most obvious, and yet somehow we keep forgetting it. When people in power claim they're restricting others for their own protection, you should be deeply suspicious, because that's exactly what Victorian society said about women. We're not oppressing you, they said. We're protecting you. Your delicate bodies can't handle education. Your gentle natures would be corrupted by politics. Your moral purity would be destroyed by the public sphere. We're keeping you safe. We're elevating you. We're giving you the sacred duty of the home. And all of it was a lie. Not a lie in the sense that the people saying it necessarily knew it was false, though some certainly did, but a lie in the sense that it was a rationalization, a way of justifying existing power structures by claiming they were natural, inevitable, and beneficial to the very people they oppressed. This is a pattern we see over and over throughout history. Those with power claim their dominance is natural, that the people they dominate are different in ways that make dominance necessary, that any attempt to change the system will hurt the very people it's supposedly helping. And they dress up these claims in whatever authoritative language their society finds most convincing. In the Victorian era, that language was medical and scientific. Doctors said women's bodies couldn't handle independence. Scientists said women's brains were different. Biologists said women's reproductive systems would fail under stress. Today we look at those claims and laugh, monstrous brains and puny bodies, bicycle-faced, the wandering womb. They seem absurd, but they weren't absurd to the Victorians. They were cutting-edge science. They were published in medical journals. They were taught in universities. They were accepted as fact by intelligent, educated people. So here's the uncomfortable question. What are we absolutely certain of today that future generations will look back on the way we look at Victorian medical theories about women? What power structures are we justifying with claims that seem scientific and natural, but are actually just rationalizations? What forms of inequality are we defending by claiming they're inevitable or beneficial or protective? I don't have all the answers to those questions, but I know that the best way to start finding them is to look at who benefits from the current system, to ask who has power and who doesn't, to examine which restrictions are claimed to be protective and whether the people being protected actually want that protection, because that's what Victorian women showed us. They didn't want protection that came at the cost of their autonomy. They didn't want to be kept safe in cages. They didn't want elevation to pedestals they couldn't step down from. The second lesson is about how oppression justifies itself. Notice how every Victorian fear about female independence predicted catastrophe. If women got educated, they'd become infertile. If women rode bicycles, they'd become masculinized. If women voted, civilization would collapse. The predictions were always dire. The consequences were always framed as both individual and societal disaster. And here's the thing, none of it came true. Women got educated and their ovaries didn't shrivel up. Women rode bicycles and they didn't turn into depraved monsters. Women got the vote and democracy didn't crumble. Women entered professions, owned property, lived independently, and society not only survived but improved. Because it turns out that when you allow half the population to fully participate in society, you benefit from all that talent, intelligence, and capability that was previously being wasted. But before these changes happened, the warning seemed reasonable to many people. Of course, intensive studying would damage women's reproductive organs. Didn't everyone know that women had limited energy that had to be carefully managed? Of course, political participation would make women coarse and unfeminine. Wasn't the public sphere fundamentally different from women's natural domain? Of course, economic independence would destroy the family. Didn't the whole social order depend on women being dependent? The fears seemed logical because they were built on premises that everyone accepted, And those premises went unchallenged for generations because challenging them meant confronting the entire system of separate spheres. It meant admitting that maybe women weren't naturally suited only for domesticity. Maybe the differences between men and women weren't as vast as claimed. Maybe the restrictions weren't protection at all. This is how oppressive systems maintain themselves. They create self-reinforcing logic. If you accept the initial premise that women are fundamentally different from men in ways that suit them for domestic life, then all the restrictions follow naturally. And if you try to reject any individual restriction, you're told you're denying nature itself. You're asking water to flow uphill. You're trying to make women into men. You're destroying everything. But once you question the initial premise, once you ask whether the claimed differences are real or constructed, whether they're natural or convenient, the whole edifice starts to crumble. And that's exactly what happened in the Victorian era. Women questioned the premise. They proved through their own lives that they could handle education, exercise, independence, intellectual work. They demonstrated that the dire predictions were wrong. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, the system had to adapt. The third lesson is about the cost of fighting oppression. Because we've focused mostly on the victories in this story, on Mary Putnam Jacobi winning the Boylston Prize, on women getting property rights and the vote, on the new woman proving that alternative ways of life were possible. But we should also remember the cost. Think about all the women who were discouraged from pursuing education and never got to develop their talents. Think about the women who were committed to asylums for being inconvenient and spent years or decades locked away. Think about the women who stayed in abusive marriages because they had no legal right to their own property or children. Think about the women who died from clothing-related fears or complications from corsets. Think about the women who lived lives of quiet desperation, trying to be angels when there were human beings with needs and desires beyond domesticity. The women who fought for change paid a price. They faced ridicule, ostracism, violence. They were called unfeminine, unnatural, disgusting. They risked their reputations, their safety, their livelihoods. Some, like the suffragettes, were arrested and force-fed. Some lost their families. Some died before seeing the changes they fought for come to fruition. But they fought anyway, because they understood something crucial, that accepting oppression, even when it's dressed up as protection, damages the soul. That living a life confined by other people's ideas of what you should be is a form of slow death. That autonomy matters more than comfort. That dignity requires the right to make your own choices, even if those choices lead to mistakes. And their fight made it possible for every woman who came after to have options those Victorian women couldn't imagine. To go to university without being told it would damage their reproductive organs, to ride bicycles without being accused of masturbation, to wear comfortable clothing without being mobbed in the streets, to own property without it being controlled by husbands, to vote, to work in any profession, to live independently, to define themselves. The fourth lesson is perhaps the most important. Progress is not inevitable. It happens because people make it happen. Victorian society didn't suddenly become enlightened about women's capabilities. Men in power didn't wake up one day and decide to grant women rights. Every single advance we've discussed was fought for, was demanded, was claimed by women who refused to accept the status quo, and even after rights were won on paper, they had to be defended and expanded in practice. The right to vote didn't immediately translate to women being equally represented in government. The right to work didn't eliminate workplace discrimination. The right to education didn't erase assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities. Legal equality didn't create social equality. This is why studying history matters. Not to feel superior to our ancestors or to pat ourselves on the back for how far we've come, but to understand how systems of oppression work, how they justify themselves, how they adapt when challenged, and how they can be resisted and ultimately changed. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The Victorian era didn't end, not completely. We've dismantled many of the most obvious structures of female subordination. But the logic that supported those structures, the idea that men and women are fundamentally different in ways that justify different treatment, that logic persists. It manifests in different ways now, more subtle ways that are harder to name and fight. But it's there. It's there when women are told they can't be both ambitious and good mothers. When women in leadership positions are criticized for being too aggressive, while men doing the same things are praised for being strong leaders. When women's pain is dismissed by doctors who don't take their symptoms seriously. When women are expected to do most of the domestic labor and childcare even when they work full-time. When women are blamed for male violence against them. When women's bodies are regulated by others. When women's choices are questioned in ways that men's choices never are. We don't call it separate spheres anymore. We don't warn about wandering wombs or bicycle face, but we're still living with the legacy of Victorian ideas about women's nature and women's place. We're still fighting many of the same battles, just in updated forms. And that's actually the most hopeful lesson of all. Because if our Victorian ancestors could challenge and change systems of oppression that had existed for centuries that were justified by medicine and religion and tradition, that everyone said were natural and inevitable, then we can do the same. If women could win the right to vote when even Queen Victoria opposed them, if they could enter universities when doctors said it would destroy their health, if they could become new women when society mocked them as grotesque buffoons, then we can continue pushing for progress. The Victorian women who fought for independence didn't win every battle. Some of their goals remain unfinished, but they proved something crucial. They proved that change is possible, that people in power claiming something is natural doesn't make it true, that courage and persistence can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, that the arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own, but it can be bent by people willing to push. So what do we do with these lessons? We remember that protection is not the same as control. We question claims that certain people need to be restricted for their own good. We recognize that predictions of catastrophe are often just fear of change. We understand that progress requires struggle, and that struggle requires courage. We honor those who fought before us by continuing their work. And we commit to examining our own society with the same critical eye we've turned on the Victorians. Because someday people in the future will look back at us the way we look at the Victorian era. They'll study our fears, our justifications, our systems of inequality. And the question is, will they see us as people who recognized injustice and worked to change it? Or will they see us as people who, like the Victorians, were so certain we were right that we couldn't see our own biases? I'd like to think we can be the former. I'd like to think we can learn from history rather than repeat it. But that requires doing what those Victorian women did. Questioning, challenging, refusing to accept that things must stay as they are simply because they've always been that way. Demanding better, not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after. The Victorian era feared female independence because it threatened a system that benefited those in power. Every medical theory, every social restriction, every argument about natural law and divine will was ultimately about maintaining that system. But the women who lived through that era saw through the justifications. They recognized that they were fully human and deserved to be treated as such, and they fought until society had to acknowledge that truth. Their fight isn't over. The work of creating true equality continues, but we stand on the shoulders of women who refuse to be confined to narrow definitions of femininity, who rejected the angel in the house, who became new women, who proved that women could be educated, independent, politically engaged and professionally accomplished without losing their humanity or destroying civilization. We owe them our freedom, and we owe them the continuation of their work. We owe them the courage to question, to challenge, to demand. We owe them the refusal to accept protection that comes at the cost of autonomy. We owe them the willingness to look at our own society with clear eyes and ask who is being restricted, who is claiming those restrictions are necessary, and who benefits from maintaining them. The story of Victorian fears about female independence is not just a history lesson. It's a warning, it's an inspiration. It's a reminder that the fight for human dignity is never finished, that every generation has to defend and expand the rights won by previous generations. That vigilance is necessary because oppression is always ready to reassert itself, just in new forms with new justifications. So as we close this journey through Victorian anxieties, I want you to remember one thing above all. When the Victorians warned that women's independence would destroy civilization, they were right about one thing. It did destroy their civilization of female subordination, of separate spheres, of angels in houses and women as property. That civilization deserved to be destroyed. And the Victorian women who destroyed it were heroes. The civilization that replaced it isn't perfect. We're still working towards the world those pioneering women imagined. But we're closer than they ever got to see. And we're closer because they refused to accept the world as it was. They insisted it could be better. They fought to make it better. And they succeeded, even though they didn't live to see all the fruits of their labor. That's the legacy we inherit, the understanding that the world can change, that it should change, and that we have the power to change it if we're willing to do the work. The Victorian women who fought for independence have passed the torch to us, and now it's our responsibility to carry it forward, to light the way for those who come after, to continue dismantling systems of oppression wherever we find them. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the fears, the struggles, and the triumphs of women fighting for their basic human rights. Thank you for listening to these stories of courage in the face of mockery, persistence in the face of opposition, and hope in the face of seemingly impossible odds. These stories matter, these women matter, and the lessons they teach us matter now more than ever. Remember the wandering womb and how medical authority was weaponized against women. Remember Bicycle Face and how women's mobility was seen as a threat. Remember the novel reading Dangers and how women's imagination was feared. Remember Edward Clarke's theories and how education was said to damage women's bodies. Remember coverture and how women were legally erased in marriage. Remember the Bloomer scandal and how clothing became a battleground. Remember the masturbation machine panic and how women's sexuality was pathologized. Remember asylum admissions and how inconvenient women were simply locked away. Remember the suffrage battle and how women fought for the basic right to vote. Remember the new woman and how she embodied all the freedom society feared. Remember the ideology of separate spheres and how it justified everything. And remember that all of it, every fear and every restriction was wrong. The women were right. And we're living in the world they fought to create. A world that still needs work, still needs courage, still needs people willing to stand up and say, this isn't right and I'm going to do something about it. The story continues, the fight continues, and so we continue. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for understanding that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping the future. Until we meet again for another story, another journey through history, another exploration of how we got here and where we might go next, keep questioning, keep learning, keep pushing for progress, keep honouring those who fought before us by continuing their work. And above all, keep remembering that when people tell you something must be a certain way because it's natural, because it's traditional, because it's for your own good, you have the right to ask who benefits from this system, who is harmed by it, and who gets to decide. The Victorian women asked those questions. They didn't like the answers, and they changed the world. Now it's our turn. Sleep well, Dream of a better world and wake ready to build it.